Chapter 1336. After being rejected, Dao Zhao's expression turned ugly. When he returned to his own unit, he looked at the expectant faces of his subordinates. He could only pretend to be indifferent and said, "Don't worry, there are still so many enemies here and there will be more and more. 100,000 people is enough for us to kill to our heart's content." The morale of the members of the second unit was low, but when they heard their leader's words, they were all in high spirits again. That's right, there were so many enemies. Could it be that they would all be wiped out by the first unit? Look, the enemy is charging again. This time there are even more of them. A scout held a pair of binoculars and reported the situation loudly. "Ha, good. Hearing this, not only did no one on the mountain show any signs of fear, but instead the members of the first unit were all excited. On the other hand, Dao Xiao and the others were envious. Some of them were even praying in their hearts, "Don't charge so fiercely. Leave some for us to kill." The 6,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry charged forward bravely and fearlessly, as if the death of the 3,000 Baiming cavalry did not affect them at all. It had to be said that Fang Dingshan was a person who knew the army well, and he was also a general who was strict in military discipline. Of course, this was also inseparable from the environment of the Great Ming Dynasty. If a martial artist wanted to have a bright future, they could only do so through military merit. Being on the battlefield was the only chance for them to perform. In addition, the Baiming Liaodong cavalry was very clear about rewards and punishments, so the 6,000 Baiming cavalry charged forward fearlessly. "They still don't know the power of our firearms. Come, get ready. When I open fire, don't hold back and kill them all." Beta Persei shouted excitedly. He did not know how long it had been since he had a good battle. He felt all the blood in his body rushing to his head, and he only wanted to continue killing the enemies. Gunshots rang out from the distance of 300 meters, and just like before, the 6,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry fell to the ground amidst the gunshots and cannons. Still, no one could reach the top of Qiyun Mountain. 6,000 people. Although the number was twice as much as before, they were still completely wiped out in less than an hour. After the battle, Beta Persei commanded the 400 black cavalry as a reserve force to rush out of the wooden house and onto the battlefield, bringing back some of the ownerless war horses. During this process, they even discovered more than 100 wounded soldiers of the northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. When they saw the black cavalry dragon guards finally approaching, they seemed to have seen new hope. Unfortunately, in front of the 400 reserve members who were already prepared, they didn't even have the chance to jump up and swing their swords before they were killed by the flying bullets. War horses could be bought. These were all healthy horses and Bei Ming had spent a lot of money to get them. However, he couldn't take these soldiers. There were only 2,000 black cavalry soldiers on the mountain. If there were too many prisoners, it would be hard to avoid unexpected dangers. Yang Qindong was here, so he couldn't be careless about safety. They wouldn't lose the big picture for the small. A total of more than 1,000 high-quality war horses were captured. At this time they were all placed in a corner of the mountain. There was already a horse stump there. It was obvious that they were prepared. Another 6,000 black cavalry soldiers were completely wiped out. Fang Dingshan's expression became extremely ugly when he saw this. In less than an hour they had already lost 9,000 black cavalry soldiers. Fang Dingshan's heart ached. He had spent a lot of effort to train every single one of these black cavalry soldiers. On the battlefield he felt that it was not worth it even if they were replaced by 2 or 3 5-star army soldiers. But now 9,000 black cavalry soldiers rushed out and didn't even hurt a single hair on the enemy's head. This was very difficult for him to accept. The other generals stood in the big tent at this moment not knowing what to do. If someone had told them before today that 2,000 enemies would be enough to render them helpless, they would probably have laughed out loud. But when the truth really happened, they realized that nothing was impossible. What was worse was that they didn't know what to do. Retreating was impossible. It wasn't easy to catch Bugnam of Zhou Xian, and the scouts would report the surrounding situation every hour. Until now, there were no signs of other 5-star army reinforcements. How could they give up such a rare opportunity? If they couldn't retreat, then they could only charge. But how could they charge to reduce their losses and achieve their goal? Although it was called a siege, there were many ways to do so. For example, the most commonly used method was to surround the enemy without fighting. They would wait for the enemy to run out of food and water. Then they would surround the enemy and block the enemy. But the problem was that Bugnam of Zhou Xian, who was surrounded, wouldn't give them too much time. Who knew how many 5-star army soldiers had already received the news and were rushing here? Just the word wait was enough to make them fall into a disadvantage. Continue to attack. I want to see how much gunpowder they have. Wuxia, you take command. Only send out 500 cavalrymen at a time. Spread out and waste the enemy's gunpowder. Fang Dingshan was naturally unwilling to give up such a good opportunity. After thinking for a while, he made this decision. General is wise. After hearing Fang Dingshan's decision, the other generals cupped their fists and looked as if it was only natural. No matter what, a small-scale attack would reduce the risk of their lives. In their hearts, they also wanted to see how much gunpowder this 2005-star army had. Once the enemy ran out of gunpowder, it would be time for them to charge forward and seize victory. Mu Qiong accepted the order and sent out the first 500 cavalrymen. These 500 cavalrymen split into 3 different directions and charged towards the peak of Qiyun Mountain. The formation was very scattered, and this was the best way to distract the enemy's gunpowder. At the peak of the mountain, 2 hours had passed. It was finally the second team's turn to fight. However, what was depressing was that after 15 minutes, the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen still did not make any moves. This made Captain Dao Xiao unable to hold it in any longer and cursed out loud. What's going on? Did they admit defeat? I say, if you have the guts, come at me. I'll be waiting for you here. Perhaps it was because of his cursing. Not far away, they could finally see the figures of the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen. However, compared to the previous 2 attacks, there were much fewer of them. With the mindset that a few pieces were still meat, Dao Zhao's second team soldiers were still in high spirits. Everyone, follow your positions and focus on your targets. Don't waste bullets. Try to hit them with one shot. Dao Xiao was smart. He did not have as many enemies as the first team, so in terms of killing he could not compare. Since that was the case, then he would compete with his marksmanship. If he could kill an opponent with one shot, then even if there were fewer enemies he would still be able to shine. 800 muskets against 500 enemies. Before the battle even started, the result was already decided. In just 2 rounds of shooting, many of the soldiers did not even fire a single shot, and the 500 cavalrymen were all sent to meet the King of Hell. Yang Qindong had already arrived at the front of the formation. He had clearly seen what had just happened, and his heart was filled with emotions. If he had not personally been on the battlefield, he would not have thought that victory would be so simple. When the 8-Nation Alliance first entered Beijing, there were only 10,000 of them. However, they were able to beat up the Qing dynasty's army, which seemed to have a lot of resources, to the point where they could not even tell which way was north. That was because they had been constantly attacking. They were not as well prepared and well equipped as he was. The advantage of firearms against cold weapons was simply too great. On the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen's side, another 500 cavalrymen died. If one looked closely, they did not even make a splash on the battlefield. Mu Qiong's expression became very ugly. He really wanted to ask General Fang Dingshan to tell him that the battle could not continue like this, but he did not dare to. Before he received any new orders, he could only continue to charge. He only hoped that these people would waste the 5-star army's gunpowder and prepare for the final charge. Just like that, every hour or so the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen would charge. The number of people charging varied. Sometimes there were 500 of them, while other times there were only 200 to 300 of them. They were using their lives to fight the Black Cavalry's gunpowder consumption. However, wasn't this giving the Black Cavalry a chance to practice target shooting? This was a real enemy, and such a chance to practice target shooting was rare. Every soldier took the opportunity to ensure that they did not fire. If they did, they would be able to take the enemy's life. The sky quickly darkened, but the northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's attack did not stop. They already knew that there were only 2,000 Black Cavalry Dragon Guards in the mountains, so they thought that even if they had to waste time, they would exhaust the enemy's strength. In this regard, Beta Persei asked for instructions from Yang Qindong, and as expected he took measures to deal with it. A team of 200 people was the norm, and the rest were all to rest. In this way the problem was easily solved. Not long after, all kinds of snoring and grinding sounds came from the mountains. Compared to the Black Cavalry sleeping soundly, Fang Dingshan was not in the mood to sleep at all. He walked out of the main tent and looked at Qi Yunshan, who was several miles away. His eyes flashed with an indescribable anger. Just you wait. When my reinforcements arrive tomorrow, we will launch a charge all over the mountains and plains. At that time I don't believe that you will still have 1,000 hands and feet. Let's see who will be the final victor. Fang Dingshan was already angry. He swore that he would take revenge. For this he would rather fill in the 100,000 lives here. As long as he could kill Yang Chendong, everything would be worth it. Without a leader, the 5-star army would not be a threat to Baiming. Chapter 1337. At the same time, Yang Chendong, who was on Qiyun Mountain, had also woken up. When he saw that Wang Shan had also fallen asleep on his bed, he did not disturb him. Instead, he sat in front of the telegraph machine and began to report to the 1st Heavenly Cavalry Division, the new 101st Army, and the divisions directly under them. Looking at the situation on the battlefield today, his safety was naturally not a problem. Even so, what he needed to do now was not for these people to come and help him. Instead, he needed them to set up an inescapable net outside the battlefield. When the Baiming Liaodong cavalry was defeated and retreated, they would surround and eliminate the enemy. Yang Chendong wanted to use this battle to get rid of the malignant tumor of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. He wanted to use this battle to shut the mouths of the Baiming people and slap their faces. He wanted to make them uncontrollably afraid and fearful when they thought of him. Whether it was waiting or anticipating, the sky finally brightened. Both sides seemed to have formed some kind of tacit agreement. They stopped fighting and started to make breakfast. For a moment, smoke rose in spirals and floated in the sky above and below the mountain. Fang Dingshan quickly finished his breakfast. Mu Qiong walked into the main tent with a blood-red face. He did not sleep last night as he continuously planned all kinds of attacks. Unfortunately, there was almost no effect. He did not even know if this kind of attack affected the sleep of the Black Cavalry. Seeing Mu Qiong walk in, Fang Dingshan sat up straight and asked with a trace of expectation, "How is it?" He already knew that the result would not be good. Otherwise he would not have sent people to find Mu Qiong. Mu Qiong would have taken the initiative to come. This subordinate is guilty. Mu Qiong did not say anything else and knelt on the ground. Although it was Fang Dingshan who gave the order to continuously attack, Fang Dingshan was a superior. He was the one who carried out the order. If there was a problem, he would have to take responsibility. Fortunately, although Fang Dingshan was greedy for power, he was not an unreasonable person. "All right, stand up and speak." This general gave the order. "No matter what the result is, I will not blame you." "Thank you, General." Mu Qiong's face finally looked better and he spoke more clearly. "General, after the sky turned dark yesterday, I continuously ordered my men to charge. There were a total of 13 times and nearly 3,000 cavalrymen were killed. Due to the cover of the night, only 7 of them managed to escape and 5 of them were injured." Fang Dingshan's face darkened when he heard that they had lost so much in one night. However, he still asked expectantly, "Did anyone manage to get to the top of the mountain? Do you know how much gunpowder they have left?" "No. The defenses on the mountain are tight. We don't have a chance to rush up." Mu Qiong lowered his head and said nervously. Although Fang Dingshan had expected this outcome, he still sighed in disappointment when he heard it. "Is Qiyun Mountain really so heavily guarded?" "Yes, they have something that can light up everything. Once we charge, this thing will appear and all of our cavalrymen will be exposed. They won't even have time to react before they are shot dead by firearms." Mu Qiong was amazed by the advanced weaponry of the Black Cavalry as he spoke with lingering fear. He would never forget that once the thing that could light up everything appeared, it would be as bright as day on the top of the mountain, and no one would be able to hide from it. "If that's the case, we can't even attack at night." Fang Dingshan was shocked to hear that such an advanced weapon had appeared. He had completely given up on the idea of attacking at night. Yes, once that thing appears, the cavalrymen will be unprepared and will not be able to adapt to it. Especially the war horses, they will neigh uncontrollably and will not be able to charge at full speed. Mu Qiong wanted to continue exaggerating the power of the weapon, but Fang Dingshan interrupted him. "Right, I got it. Yes, then go and rest." "General, aren't we going to attack later?" Mu Qiong was naturally happy to hear that he could rest, but he was also worried that he would be woken up before he could fall asleep, so he asked. "Wait, General Luo will be here soon. Once he arrives, we will launch a big attack. No matter what, this time we must take down Qiyun Mountain and take Bugnam of Gojoseon's head." Fang Dingshan was almost furious as he spoke. If one listened carefully, one could hear the sound of teeth gnashing. The battlefield suddenly quieted down. This made Qiuvi and Dao Xiao unhappy. After resting for a night, they thought that the battle would continue and they would be able to kill to their heart's content. However, Baiming's Liaodong cavalry was terrified. This was really disappointing. Don't worry, it's just the darkness before dawn. Perhaps the big attack will begin soon. Yang Qindong's face was calm, but his words were full of murderous intent. He didn't believe that Baiming's Liaodong cavalry would give up the chance to kill him. They weren't attacking now, but they were just waiting. The more they acted like this, the more it meant that the scale of the next attack would be huge. In the eyes of the Black Cavalry, Yang Qindong was like a god. Since he said so, no one doubted him. Knowing that a big battle was imminent, all the soldiers began to clean their guns and reload, preparing for the battle that could erupt at any time. It was noon. Baiming's Liaodong cavalry still didn't move, but there were rumbling sounds of horses galloping on the ground not far away. As dust rose into the air, Deputy General Luo Baikuan finally brought the rest of the Baiming's Liaodong cavalry over. A total of 85,000 Baiming's Liaodong cavalry gathered together. Looking down from the mountain, it was a black mass. It was a spectacular sight. Are they finally here? Yang Qindong took the binoculars and looked down the mountain. After seeing everything clearly, a cold smile appeared on his face. He had a feeling that the enemy's charge would begin soon. At this moment he couldn't help but sigh at how difficult Fang Dingshan was to deal with. Imagine if they attacked in the afternoon, there was no need to talk about using it. But if they failed, they could use the night to retreat. That way, even if there was an ambush outside, it would be extremely difficult to catch them all. Before planning for victory, one had to think about defeat. This was a quality that a good general had to have. Come on, adjust the muzzles. Once the enemy attacks, immediately launch a blanket attack on the enemy camp. This time, we need to kill as many of the enemy's forces as possible, so that they won't be able to pose any threat for a while. Yang Qindong said as if he was preparing for a rainy day. If the enemy wanted to do something ruthless, why wouldn't he do the same? At that moment, the 100mm mortars on the mountain were fully prepared. Other than that, a few flamethrowers and grenades were also taken out. The light and heavy machine guns were loaded with ammunition to ensure that once they opened fire, they would be able to continuously kill the enemy. Send a telegram to the 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Division of the new army, and the subordinate division to prepare to face the scattered enemy. Yang Qindong didn't forget about the cavalry army outside. This was enough to prove his confidence in the Black Cavalry. At the foot of the mountain, Luo Baikuan walked into the main tent in full armor and came in front of Fang Dingshan. Once he entered the tent, Luo Baikuan said anxiously, "General, is Bugnam of Gojosian sure that he's on the mountain?" "Yes." Fang Dingshan nodded and answered with a very confident tone. Hearing this answer, Luo Baikuan smiled. He gave up the opportunity to completely annihilate the heavy cavalry regiment to come here. If Bugnam of Gojosian wasn't on the mountain and there were only 2,000 black cavalry soldiers, he wouldn't be interested. But now it was different. If he could kill Yang Qindong, it would definitely be a great achievement. No matter how many heavy cavalry regiments he annihilated, it would still be incomparable. "General, when are we going to attack?" Luo Baikuan didn't know the power of the firearms in the black cavalry soldiers' hands. At this moment he was a little anxious. Perhaps he didn't even put the black cavalry in his eyes. After all, there were only 2,000 people. No matter how powerful they were, it was only 2,000 people. Against almost 100,000 elite Baiming Liaodong heavy cavalry, what could they do? Seeing Luo Baikuan's confidence, Fang Dingshan wanted to come to the same conclusion. But when he thought of the big loss he suffered yesterday, he had to be realistic. They have firearms. Don't underestimate them. Firearms? When Luo Baikuan heard this, he still said disapprovingly, "I've seen firearms before. Just like the 20,000 firearms camp that Gao Yu brought, it's just SSO. We can take it down with one charge. There are only 2,000 enemies here. What can they do? We have the advantage in numbers. Victory is not a problem at all." Luo Baikuan's confident words were heard by Fang Dingshan, and he was very encouraged. "Yes, we have the advantage in numbers. Even if the enemy's firearms are powerful, they can't kill us all. As long as we can rush to the top of the mountain, victory will be ours." Fong Dingshan, who had received encouragement, was grinning from ear to ear. Then he called in the generals to make arrangements for the battle. At this moment he seemed to be able to see the scene of Yang Qindong's head being chopped off and presented to the Daizong Emperor. Looking down from the bottom of the mountain, he could see the Baiming Liaodong heavy cavalry gathering their troops. Seeing more and more enemies getting on their horses, Yang Qindong put down his binoculars after he pulled out his sabers. Prepare to load the ammunition. Fire the cannons. Baiming Liaodong heavy cavalry was ready to charge. Yang Qindong couldn't just let them do as they pleased. After all, the difference in numbers was too great. If he really waited for the enemy to charge in front of him before he opened fire, with the cavalry's speed, the enemy would reach him in 300 meters. If that was the case, he would be in danger. He couldn't just sit there and wait for death. He had to strike first. He believed that since the enemy decided to charge, they wouldn't stop just because he made the first move. Chapter 1338. Once the order was given, the 30 mortars that had been prepared and calibrated were immediately loaded with ammunition. When Yang Qindong saw the 30 soldiers holding 30 cannonballs looking at him, he didn't hesitate and said, "Load and fire." Fire. With a loud shout, the 30 cannonballs were quickly swallowed by the cannon barrel. Then there was a loud rumbling sound. The cannonballs drew a beautiful arc in the sky and fell towards the camp of the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry. At this moment, the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry were still preparing. There were simply too many people. There had to be an arrangement as to who would attack first and who would follow suit. Otherwise, if they all rushed forward, there would be no space for them to display their skills. They might even end up crowding each other. Suddenly, there was a whistling sound in the sky. The Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry, who were still preparing, instinctively looked up. However, the speed of the cannonballs was too fast for them to catch sight of. When they raised their heads, they saw bursts of flames appearing beside them, followed by thunderous booms. Boom, 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 boom. When the cannonballs landed, they landed right in the middle of the dense crowd. For a moment, a powerful shockwave blew over like a gale. The northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry were thrown off their horses like kites with their strings cut. Some of the war horses were also frightened and began to flee in all directions while neighing incessantly. The war horse, which had always been docile, no longer recognized its owner. In its shock, it ran around randomly, crashing into all directions. Who knew how many of the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry were knocked to the ground and trampled by the horses' hooves? The cannonballs sounded and tents were overturned. Some even caused a sea of fire, giving people a feeling of purgatory. Don't panic, don't panic. Follow me and charge. Charge. Luo Baikun saw the cannonballs falling and messing up the formation of the army. He was naturally furious. While he was shocked by the power of the Black Cavalry's cannonballs, he made a bold decision to charge immediately. Otherwise, who knew how messy the army would be if this continued and whether they would have the ability to counterattack. The roar of the cannonballs and explosions disrupted the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's formation, making them unable to gather on time and launch a large-scale charge. It also forced the enemy to attack as soon as possible. Calling it a decisive battle was a bit of an exaggeration. One side had 80,000 elite cavalry while the other side only had 2,000 black cavalry. The difference in numbers was too great. Calling it a decisive battle was a bit wrong because this was a one-sided massacre. It had nothing to do with a decisive battle. Calling it a decisive battle was inappropriate. There had never been a decisive battle where one side had lost soldiers and generals while the other side had no losses. Rather than calling it a decisive battle, it was more appropriate to call it a suicidal battle. The roar of the cannonballs continued. One cannonball after another landed in the camp of the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. Whether it was those who were about to charge, those who were preparing to charge, or those who were left behind, none of them were spared. This was because no one knew where the next cannonball would land and who it would kill. The sound of gunfire continued like the firecrackers set off by the rich during the New Year. There was no sign of it stopping. As the bullets were fired, the war horses that were charging forward were hit one after another. The cavalrymen on the war horses were hit one after another. They had no choice but to fall to the side with their horses. The sound of explosions continued. When the enemy was about 100 meters away from them, rocket launchers fired one after another, landing in the crowd, causing waves of explosions and screams of agony. If the enemy was a bit closer, the grenades would fall from the sky like raindrops falling from the sky. At the same time, they would create a huge blaze, and at the same time, they would also kill and injure the northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. The 2,000 Black Cavalry on Qiyun Mountain divided up the work in an orderly manner. Some were firing cannonballs, some were shooting, and some were throwing grenades. They were all busy at this moment. Almost all of the 2,000 people were using it. No one stopped to rest. Everyone was very busy. Although it was very tiring, it was worth it. It was because this kind of battle was not something that could be encountered all the time. Fortunately, the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry had strict discipline and a clear goal. They wanted to kill Yang Chendong wholeheartedly. If it was another opponent, they would have been scared away. Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's losses continued to increase. More than half of 1,000 people would be lost before they reached the halfway point of the mountain. When they were only a few dozen meters away, not a single one would be left. The highest peak of Qiyun Mountain seemed to have become a natural moat. A huge gap completely separated the two sides. Even if you had the power to split the sky, you would still not be able to take a step forward. Charge, continue to charge. Don't be afraid of death. They only have 2,000 cavalry. Luo Baikuan had already stopped his warhorse. He brought some of his soldiers to hide behind a few big trees. They used the branches to hide themselves. The losses were so great that Luo Baikuan's heart was bleeding at every moment. However, he could no longer shout for them to stop. After fighting for so long, if they stopped, then all of their previous efforts would be wasted. He wanted to see how much gunpowder the enemy had. He did not believe that his 80,000 cavalry would not be able to exhaust the enemy's gunpowder. As long as the enemy's firearms could not be used, he believed that the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's spit could take Bugnam of Gojoseon's life. The Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry continued to charge. Although many people saw the power of the firearms, they could only continue to charge since their superiors did not give the order to retreat or stop attacking. This was especially true when some of their fellow soldiers had died right beside them, which made them feel deeply stimulated. At this moment they were like mad bulls. They only knew to keep moving forward. They only had one goal, which was to rush to the top of the mountain and kill the Black Knight Dragon Guards. The charge was still going on. At a certain camp at the foot of the mountain, Fong Dingshan was already vomiting blood from the heartache. The Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry was an elite cavalry unit that he had painstakingly built. In an environment where Baiming lacked warhorses, it was easy to imagine how difficult it was to form a cavalry unit with 100,000 people. For this reason, the Daizong Emperor did not hesitate to take out money from the state treasury from various ministers and the Northern Ming Bank to make up for the shortfall, giving him sufficient support in the hopes that he would be able to raise the army and restore the glory of the Northern Ming army. In this army that even the emperor had invested a lot of money into, Fong Dingshan had put in a lot of effort. He did not fear the dangers of the journey and came to Liaodong. With his silver tongue and large amounts of money, he persuaded many strong young men to join the army. He also went to the prison and saved some Mongolian prisoners and sent them to the army. He also found many merchants who often went to the grasslands and used a high price to buy Mongolian men who were skilled in horse riding. He also walked through many Baiming army units and picked out many strong soldiers to fill the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. It could be said that the internal structure of the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry was very complicated. It took a lot of effort for each person to join. Fortunately, the results were satisfactory. Even the famous heavy cavalry unit of the 5-star army was no match for them. This gave Fong Dingshan hope and a future. This was also the reason why he dared to bring the army here, even though he knew that Yang Chendong had appeared and was already prepared. He firmly believed that no matter how strong the opponent was, he still had a great advantage against nearly 100,000 cavalry with only 2,000 men. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. At this time, Fong Dingshan was trapped in this argument. Seeing elite cavalrymen charging out one after another, only to quickly fall on the path of the charge. Their sabers were not stained with blood, and their strength had not been fully displayed, they were already dead. That kind of feeling made his heart ache and palpitate. What kind of brain did Bugnam of Gojoseon have to create so many powerful firearms? Just what kind of person was Wu Nan Wang to be able to create such a battle formation with the few against the many? What kind of courage did Bugnam of Gojoseon have to face 100,000 with 2,000 men and not be afraid? Instead he was filled with killing intent. At this moment Fang Dingshan hated Yang Chendong to the core. If cursing could kill someone, then even 1,000 lives would not be enough for Bugnam of Gojoseon. His eyes were red, his heart was bleeding and blood was flowing out of the corner of his mouth because of the heartache. Gradually Fang Dingshan, who was always calm and composed and never moved in the slightest, became more and more unsightly. His mental endurance had reached its limit and he was about to collapse. "General, should we retreat?" Mu Qiong was standing guard beside Fang Dingshan. He watched as countless cavalrymen charged forward, but soon there was no news of them. The lively young lad had turned into a corpse that could not move at all. How could his heart not bleed? Before he knew how much gunpowder Bugnam of Gojoseon had prepared, he thought that such a reckless charge would not solve anything, so he thought of persuading them to stop. Fang Dingshan's face showed a hint of hesitation and struggle, but he quickly shook his head. "No, we can't stop." Indeed they could not stop. If this could not take down Yang Chendong, Fang Dingshan did not know when he would have the chance to kill this person. As long as Yang Chendong did not die, Baiming would be in danger, and it was not impossible for the country to be destroyed. Therefore, no matter how high the price he had to pay, Fang Dingshan could not retreat and he could not hesitate. He wanted to pay with lives today. He wanted to see how long the 5-star army could last. Did they not know how tiring it was to kill people? Baiming's Liaodong cavalry did not show any signs of stopping, and the gunshots on Qian Mountain did not stop either. However, if one listened carefully, the gunshots were not as intense as before. Chapter 1339. On the top of the mountain, the heavy machine guns had already become scalding hot due to overheating. Some light machine guns also had the same problem. Fortunately, there was enough water on the mountain. At this moment, buckets of water were poured under the guns, igniting a large amount of steam. Stop the light and light machine guns appropriately and use them after cooling down. All the people who have retreated, go get grenades and blow up these enemies. Yang Chendong's voice replaced Beta Persei's. In a war that had never been organized with such intensity, Beta Persei's commanding ability obviously still needed to be improved. Fortunately, Yang Chendong in his previous life had seen all kinds of storms and waves, so he quickly replaced the commanding position. Under his command, the 2,000 black cavalry did their own things in an orderly manner and dealt a heavy blow to the enemy. Beta Persei was still learning seriously from the side. However, he didn't know if there would be another chance to command like this. After all, not every enemy was as brave, fearless and disciplined as Baiming's Liaodong cavalry. Countless grenades were thrown down the mountain. After a series of explosions and smoke, another batch of Baiming's Liaodong cavalry fell on the charging road. Yang Chendong took this opportunity to wipe the sweat on his forehead. At this moment he had to admit that Baiming's Liaodong cavalry's bravery was beyond his expectations. If it wasn't for his ample preparation, he was afraid that the enemy might have really rushed up. If that was the case, with only the 2,000 black cavalry he could only rely on Dazong to rush out. That was his trump card and he wouldn't use it easily. Otherwise some things wouldn't be easy to explain. The bravery of Baiming's Liaodong cavalry was beyond Yang Chendong's expectations, but how could it not be a happy thing? The fiercer the other party charged now, the greater the losses would be, and the less of a threat they might pose to him in the future. It was even possible to wipe them all out here. That way the threat of Baiming would be greatly reduced, and the entire 5-star army would be able to spare more energy and manpower to do what they wanted to do. The sound of gunfire was still going on. For hours later, the sky outside was completely dark. The only thing that could be seen on the battlefield was the muzzle flashes that constantly spewed out bullets, as well as the flares that were fired into the air from time to time. Every time the flare lit up, gunshots would ring out. Groups of northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong iron cavalry would fall down like sand blown by the wind. This scene was clearly seen by everyone under the illumination of the flares. As more and more of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry became corpses, the morale of the army began to waver. No one in the world was willing to die. As long as there was a bit of hope to live, they wouldn't take the initiative to seek death. The previous attack was completely due to the strict discipline of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry, and the fact that the target was only 2,000 people, which gave countless people hope. But now, seeing that the five-star army's gunfire didn't seem to stop, and even the heavy and light machine guns that had stopped firing were starting to ring out again, some of the soldiers who thought that the five-star army didn't have enough gunpowder finally began to feel disappointed. There was no chance of victory at all, and they were only using human lives to fill the gap. When would this kind of battle end? If the 80,000 cavalry were all here, but the other party still had gunpowder, what would they do? Wouldn't that mean that everyone had died here for nothing? Everyone had their own selfish motives, especially on a battlefield where there was no chance of victory. Some people couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. The first to make a move were the Mongolian grassland men that Fong Dingshan had spent a lot of money to invite from the merchants. They were like mercenaries and they came here for money. As long as someone paid them, they would give their lives. Even if they died in battle, they wouldn't regret it. But even if they knew that they would die, they still wanted to charge. That wasn't something a greedy person would do. Even if they had money, they had to be alive to spend it. When they saw that the five-star army was still full of firepower, these people were shaken. Then some self-proclaimed smart people began to flee under the cover of the night when no one was watching them. When the first person retreated, the people around him quickly followed suit. Soon more and more cavalrymen began to disregard the military order and retreat. Their retreat was like a domino effect, causing more and more cavalrymen to retreat. Humans were social animals. What they would do the most was follow suit. When they saw that the people around them had begun to retreat, it was their nature to retreat as well. As for the so-called consequences, that was a matter for the future. As a result, on the battlefield in the dark, more and more Baiming Liaodong cavalry started to retreat. It was like a plague that spread to everyone. Many cavalry who didn't know what was going on thought that it was an order from the general and also retreated. Luo Baikuan, who was hiding under the cover of the trees, quickly realized that something was wrong. He knew that the thing he was most worried about had happened. In order to obtain the final victory, there was no time for him to think. He rushed out from his hiding place and shouted, "Everyone listen to my order. Continue to charge. Charge. Those who retreat will die." After shouting this, Luo Baikuan rode his warhorse into the battlefield and slashed at the head of a Mongolian soldier who was retreating. Swoosh. With one slash, a head rolled to the ground. At this time, Luo Baikuan was like a killing god. He ignored the blood splattered on his body as he shouted loudly, "This general is here. Those who retreat will be killed." Luo Baikuan used his actions to show everyone what battlefield discipline was. This action also frightened many of the surrounding cavalrymen. The soldiers who originally wanted to retreat had no choice but to stop what they were doing. Phew! Seeing that the army had temporarily stabilized, Luo Baikuan let out a sigh of relief. In order to increase the victory, he shouted, "They only have 2,000 people. They can't have so much gunpowder. As long as we persevere, victory will be ours." He was still cheering his subordinates on, encouraging them to continue to charge. It could also be said that he was encouraging them to die. Suddenly, a flare lit up in the sky and lit up the mountainside like it was daytime. With the help of the flare, the black cavalry at the top of the mountain saw everything. When they saw a small number of Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen, Ba Daojiang, who was in charge of artillery support, laughed. "Come on, charge to the mountainside and open fire." When the flare lit up, Luo Baikuan, who was riding on his horse, had a bad feeling. However, he didn't retreat immediately because he knew that many soldiers were looking at him. If he were to hide like this, the morale of the army would definitely be greatly affected. He was afraid that the army would really be routed. With a fluke mentality, Luo Baikuan continued to shout to the soldiers gathered around him, "There is no one in this world that can't be killed. We have a strong advantage in numbers. As long as everyone works together, victory will definitely belong to us. As long as we can kill Bugnam of Gojoseon, we will all be heroes. The great Ming dynasty will remember us and we will be conferred the title of Marquis." Chirp, boom. Just as Luo Baikuan was encouraging the morale of the army, suddenly, dozens of cannonballs fell from the sky and covered their area. Coincidentally, one of the cannonballs landed 3 meters away from Luo Baikuan. Following a loud bang, an indescribable wave of air enveloped Luo Baikuan. Luo Baikuan, who was still thinking of saying something on his warhorse, felt his chest tighten. Then he was separated from his warhorse and flew into the air. Luo Baikuan, who was flying in the air, still had his mouth open. However, because his internal organs were severely injured, he could no longer utter a single word. As he opened and closed his mouth, streams of dark red blood flowed out. Luo Baikun was actually blown away. One could imagine that the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen who had recovered some of their morale could not take it anymore. Their general was dead, so why were they still guarding here? Even if they were to charge, who would they charge for? Run. No one knew who shouted so loudly, but the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen began to collapse. This move quickly became a trend that no one could stop. Fong Dingshan, who was waiting for the news of victory, suddenly saw countless black figures retreating from the foot of the mountain. His eyes could not help but widen. He knew that the result he was most afraid of had happened. Before this, Fong Dingshan had already made up his mind. As long as the soldiers did not retreat, he would not retreat. Even if he had to sacrifice all of the Baiming Liaodong cavalrymen, as long as he could kill Yang Chendong, everything would be worth it. But now the army suddenly retreated. He did not give such a military order, so there was only one result. The army's morale and momentum were gone. This was the only result. It's over, it's over. Tears fell from the corner of Fong Dingshan's eyes. He knew that the situation was over. At this time, even if he stood out and wanted to boost the army's morale, it was obviously impossible. Dispersing was dispersing. It was not something that anyone could gather in a short period of time. Fong Dingshan, who said that it was over, did not manage to catch his breath and immediately fainted. If Mu Qiong hadn't reacted quickly enough and caught him, he would have been seriously injured from the fall. Mu Qiong did not understand why the general suddenly fainted. Just as he was panicking, a fast horse came in front of him. Reporting, General Luo Baikun has died in battle. The army has begun to retreat. Chapter 1340. What? This bad news finally made Mu Qiong understand what had happened. He sighed at how fast the general's reaction was, and his expression changed. The army had retreated. Didn't that mean that they had lost the battle? Since they had lost, they had to fight the way they lost. Thinking of this, he immediately said, "Even so, we can't just sit here and wait for death. All troops retreat and find a safe place to wait for the general to wake up. Retreat." Without Fong Dingshan and Luo Baikun, Mu Qiong's orders were naturally the most important. Under the command of this general who had long wanted to retreat, the army could finally retreat openly. The Baiming Liaodong cavalry who had received the military order and were prepared to risk their lives to charge finally heaved a sigh of relief. Then none of them charged up the mountain. They turned around and fled in all directions without any pattern. On the peak of Qiyun Mountain, the exhausted black cavalry was still waiting for the Baiming Liaodong cavalry to charge. But all of a sudden the battlefield quieted down, which made everyone feel that it was unreal. For the past few hours the enemy's warhorses had been charging. Shouts and screams shook the sky. Under the sound of guns and cannons, many people's ears were buzzing. They were not used to the sudden silence. However, when Yang Chendong heard that there was no sound of horses charging, his whole body shook. After taking a look through the binoculars, he became even more determined. He said, "The Baiming Liaodong cavalry can't win and want to escape. Men, fire the cannons. Even if they want to escape, we have to skin them alive." Boom boom boom. Boom boom boom. Under Yang Chendong's order the cannons rumbled. Who knew how many of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry who were fleeing were hit by the cannons and died tragically on the ground. Soon there was a roar of excitement on Qiyun Mountain. "We won. We won." Yang Er shouted. At the same time he jumped up and down non-stop. The other commanders and soldiers were also cheering loudly, celebrating the moment of victory. Even if they had the most advanced firearms in their hands, no one could guarantee that they would win against nearly 100,000 cavalry with only 2,000 soldiers. Only they themselves would know if there were people who were worried or on edge during the process. And now they had finally obtained the final victory. At this moment, everyone was extremely excited. At the same time they looked at Yang Chendong with admiration. This was their king. He fought against 100,000 with 2,000 soldiers and forced the enemy to retreat. Although there were many people in history who won against the enemy, only their king could achieve such a glorious result. They were proud to be part of their king's side. "How many people did we kill?" Among the cheers, it was unknown who had suddenly said such a sentence. but it instantly attracted everyone's attention. 30,000? I think it's more than that. Our first platoon killed nearly 20,000 people. Chiovi shook his head. Obviously he was dissatisfied with the number of soldiers. That's right. I think there were at least 40,000 people. Our second platoon also killed nearly 20,000 people. Dao Xiao also jumped out. Although he did not have to worry about the military merit because he was with Yang Qindong, he still had to fight for it. Are you kidding me? Did our artillery team not do anything? We killed at least 10,000 people. Ba Daojiang also stood out. He would never allow anyone to take away his achievement. Not even the two platoon leaders. For a moment, there was a heated discussion about how many people they had killed. Yang Qindong did not participate. Because of the firearms and the dark sky, he did not know how many people they had killed. However, he believed that he would get the results soon. Because outside of Qiyun Mountain, the 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Division of the new 1st Army, and the 1st Cavalry Division of the new 2nd Army were all in place. As long as they stopped the Baiming Liaodong cavalry, they would be able to get a rough idea of how many people they had lost. Yes, the 1st Cavalry Division of the new 2nd Army had also arrived outside of Qiyun Mountain. They were led by the commander of the Mercenary Division. His original mission was to guard Tulu City with 2 divisions to prevent the 50,000 Baiming army inside the city from converging with the 80,000 Baiming army outside the city. However, as the commander of the Mercenary Division that Yang Qindong had entrusted with such an important task, he was not a passive person. When he arrived on the battlefield, he quickly displayed his skills. He sent people to disguise themselves as the Baiming army to open the city gates and force their way into Tulu City. The sudden arrival of the 2 divisions of cavalry caused the 50,000 Baiming army to panic. Most of them were new soldiers who had never been on the battlefield. Although they had undergone some training, they had never seen real combat. They had never even seen blood. How could they be a match for the elite new 2nd Army cavalry? In just a little more than 4 hours, Tulu City had become the territory of the new 2nd Army. She had once come from this place, so she was naturally very familiar with every blade of grass and tree here. Soon she issued a series of correct orders. Not only did she take complete control of Tulu City, she also seized a large amount of food and 45,000 captives. After the great victory in Tulu City, Mercenary Division received news that Yang Qindong had used himself as bait to lure the Baiming Liaodong cavalry into Qiyun Mountain. He immediately handed over the task of defending the city to the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Division, Li Jun. Then he brought the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, Qiao Chao, and hurried towards Qiyun Mountain. When Yang Qindong received the news that another division had joined, he was naturally overjoyed. This gave him even more confidence in surrounding the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. If it wasn't for the fact that the Black Cavalry had just gone through an intense battle and were all exhausted, he probably would have joined in the pursuit of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. Everyone has contributed and is tired. Leave behind 200 people to guard the city at night. Everyone else take the time to rest. We'll clean up the battlefield when the sun rises. Yang Qindong laughed and said to everyone. After seeing everyone's excited smile, he didn't rest. Instead, he went to the simple sand table and looked at the surrounding situation. In this battle, he had already crippled the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. However, even if he didn't wipe them out, it was still an extremely important task. Otherwise, once the enemy was given enough time, it wouldn't take long for them to rise from the ashes. This wasn't the result Yang Qindong wanted to see. Looking at the sand table, Yang Qindong was thinking about where the Baiming Liaodong cavalry might escape. At the same time, a voice kept ringing in his mind. Tiger's Mane, Shibei, and Lu Zhuo will definitely be able to do it. They will definitely be able to deal a heavy blow to the Baiming Liaodong cavalry and eliminate this stubborn enemy. The northern Ming's Liaodong Iron Cavalry had suffered a crushing defeat on Mount Qiyun. After charging up the mountain and suffering heavy injuries, it could be said that their morale had plummeted. They no longer had their previous invincible momentum. At this moment they were fleeing everywhere like stray dogs. Some were in groups of 1,000, some were in groups of 100, and some were in groups of a dozen or even a few people. The defeated soldiers were like this. There was no formation at all. They just dragged their battered bodies and ran without knowing where to go. Some people even lost their war horses. However, they still kept running in order to escape from Qiyun Mountain. In their hearts, this was the gate to hell. No matter who stayed here, they would only die. The defeat of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry gave the five-star army a great opportunity. The divisions of the various armies formed a huge encirclement with the company as a unit. Whenever they saw a defeated enemy, they would wait for an opportunity to attack. If there were a few more enemies, they would immediately send out a signal to ask for help from the other companies. In short, it was to seal off this area so that not a single bird could fly out. Yang Qindong's orders were exactly like this. Although he did not know how much damage the Baiming Liaodong cavalry had suffered in this battle, he believed that the enemy's discipline was loose and their morale was low. The five-star army, who had always worshipped Yang Qindong's words, naturally acted according to the order, and the encirclement by the company was launched. The orders were given without any hesitation. However, not everyone had their own thoughts. For example, the heavy cavalry regiment commander Zhou Xian, who was hiding in a valley with a company, was currently waiting for a battle. His heart was beating like a drum. He was very clear about the strength of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. Even his heavy cavalry regiment was not a match for them. He also heard that the 6th young master only had 2,000 black cavalry. Could they really face 100,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry and not be defeated? If this was said by someone else, Zhou Xian would naturally not believe it. He would even accuse the other party of false military intelligence and punish them. However, this came from the 6th young master, so he did not dare to say anything. All this time no one knew how many miracles Yang Qindong had created. It was to the point that everyone was used to him doing some shocking things and would not suspect anything. Zhou Xian was still thinking about the reliability of this matter. If it was true, how did the 6th young master do it? While this question was still flashing in his mind, the company commander suddenly said, "Commander Zhou Xian, there is a situation." Zhou Xian immediately put away his chaotic thoughts. He held the binoculars in his hand and looked up. He saw no less than 700 cavalry wearing the northern Ming military uniform rushing towards them in a panic. Among these 700 people, only half of them had war horses. There were also some that only borrowed the power of their legs and held their ponytails. It seemed that this was the only way they would not fall behind. Only then would they be able to live and die with the main force. There are more than 700 people. Commander Zhou Xian, let's send the signal for reinforcements. This company commander only led 100 people. Seeing that the enemy was 7 times their number, he could not help but feel nervous. This was the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. It was rumored that they were very powerful. Even the heavy cavalry regiment had suffered a loss in their hands. Chapter 1341. Zhou Xian naturally saw the enemy's numbers, but he wasn't as flustered as the company commander beside him. Instead, he carefully looked through his binoculars and shook his head. Look, although the enemy has a lot of people, they are clearly defeated soldiers. The army has no formation and has no morale. So what if there are more of them? Although we only have 100 people, we can wait patiently. The morale of the army is not something the enemy can match. What is there to fear? Hearing Zhou Feng's bold words, the company commander understood why he could become a regiment commander. Moreover, he was the regiment commander of the heavy cavalry regiment. He wasn't any worse than a normal division commander. Turned out that she was this daring. Just this point alone was something that the current him could not compare to. Admiring Zhou Feng's courage, the company commander was also encouraged. Regiment Commander Zhou, you mean to say that we don't need to ask for help and can eat them with our own strength? That's right, this is a great merit. Could it be that everyone doesn't want to contribute? Zhou Xian was clear that these weren't soldiers of the heavy cavalry regiment. If he wanted to use his status as a regiment commander to suppress them, it wouldn't be too effective. Thus he could only use benefits to entice them. The military merits of the 5-star army were not bad rewards. This was the magic weapon to defeat the enemy. When it came to contributions, the eyes of the 100 soldiers couldn't help but shine. Then there was the sound of rapid breathing. After a few breaths, the company commander had already made a decision and said, "Regiment Commander Zhou, we will listen to you. We will do whatever you say." Zhou Xian was waiting for this sentence. He immediately replied with a good, and then ordered, "Everyone, don't be anxious. After all, we are still at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. In a moment we will divide into 10 groups and surround them. When the enemy is within 100 steps, we will suddenly use bows and arrows to attack from afar. Then the 1st to 7th groups will charge out. The 8th to 10th groups will stay in place and continuously appear. This will give the enemy the feeling that we have a lot of troops and trick them. Do you understand? As if he felt that he had not said enough, wind-chasing wolf added, "Of course, you don't have to be afraid. If the enemy's momentum is too strong, we can retreat. Then we can send a signal and surround them with the other company commanders." Whether it was advancing or retreating, all of them had already been chosen. The warriors were no longer flustered, and they began to prepare according to the tactics that Windchaser had arranged. After the 100-man team was dispersed, it gave people the impression that their military strength had doubled and there were hundreds of them. Just as the soldiers of each company reached their designated positions, the defeated Baiming Liaodong cavalry arrived within 100 steps of them. Windchaser took the lead and shot out an arrow. A Baiming Liaodong cavalry soldier at the front fell off his horse. Following that, another wave of arrows shot out and dozens of enemy soldiers were ambushed. This sudden attack caused the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry, who were already trembling with fear, to become even more chaotic. It was at this moment that Shui Feng led 7 squads of warriors and charged out from the shadows, loudly shouting that those who surrendered would not be killed. Behind them there was a cloud of dust. Those were the 30 warriors who were left behind, constantly running back and forth, creating a commotion to strengthen their momentum. The sudden appearance of the 5-star army was like a heavenly army descending from the heavens. It gave the Baiming Liaodong cavalry a heavy psychological blow. They were already like arrows at the end of their flight. Right now they were already like birds startled by the twang of a bow. Any movement would cause them to feel fear. The Baiming Liaodong cavalry had already lost their basic judgment. When they saw the cloud of dust behind the 5-star army, they naturally thought that the main force of the 5-star army had arrived. They had already lost their will to fight. When they heard the shouts of those who surrendered would not be killed, they didn't stop at all. One by one they threw down their weapons, jumped off their horses and knelt on the ground. Perhaps in the hearts of these Baiming Liaodong cavalry, surrendering was not something shameful. As long as they could live, it was good. Just like on Chiyun Mountain facing the barrage of guns and cannons, they couldn't find a way to surrender even if they wanted to. Now that the hope of living was in front of them, who wouldn't cherish it? This was like someone giving you a pillow when you were sleepy. Who would care if the pillow was suitable for your head? Shui Feng was already prepared for a bloody battle. In his heart, unless it was necessary, he didn't want to ask for help from the other companies. After all, he had just lost a battle and now was the time to gain merit. He didn't want to let go of this opportunity. However, he never would have thought that these Baiming Liaodong cavalry would be so weak. After he jumped out with his men, they surrendered without a trace of struggle. This made him wonder if these were the elite Baiming Liaodong cavalry that had surrounded his heavy cavalry regiment. While Shui Feng was doubting, how could the nearby 5-star army officers not be thinking the same thing? In a short period of time, it wasn't just this company that had encountered the enemy. Many of the 5-star army soldiers who were lying in ambush were also like this. The one similarity was that when they suddenly charged out, the Baiming Liaodong cavalry all chose to kneel and surrender. Under the lack of morale, who knew how many people had already chosen the path of surrender? They just didn't have the opportunity to do so before, but now that the opportunity had come, of course they had to firmly grasp it. Things were far simpler than imagined. Before the sky turned dark, the battle reports from the various companies were gathered before the several commanders and division commanders. From the statistics, in just a single day's time, they captured no less than 40,000 northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. This was 40,000 people. If they wanted to capture 40,000 pigs alive, who knew how much effort it would take? From this, it could be seen that the Baiming Liaodong cavalry's morale was already in chaos and they had no will to fight. The most exaggerated thing was that they learned about the battle at Qiyun Mountain from the captives. When they learned that Yang Chendong only led 2,000 black cavalry and blocked the attacks of nearly 100,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry for more than a day and even heavily injured 40,000 people, everyone was so shocked that their jaws dropped. 2,000 against 100,000, not only did they obtain victory, they also killed 40,000 people and forced the others to retreat. What kind of combat power did they have to be able to accomplish this? Seeing this result, even the always confident Commander Tian, who couldn't help but sigh, "The Black Cavalry is so strong that our 1st Cavalry Division can't compare." After this battle, It was completely established that the Black Cavalry was the strongest army in the entire five-star army. Although many people knew that the reason why they won was because of the great contributions of the guns and cannons, they couldn't help but admit that just the courage of 2,000 against 100,000 was not something an ordinary person could do. In just one day they had captured 40,000 captives. This gave the five-star army more confidence. The only fly in the ointment was that they didn't find their commander Fong Dingshan among the captives. According to the captives, their commander was protected by another general, Mu Qiong, and 2,000 people were together. There's no need to say more. From all the facts, Fong Dingshan still hasn't broken out of the encirclement. If I were him, I would definitely choose a place to break out of the encirclement tonight. After Tian Hu heard this, he expressed his thoughts in front of the new 2nd Army's commander Shi Bei and the 101st Army's commander Lu Zhuo. This point coincided with Shi Bei and Lu Zhuo's thoughts. After the three of them looked at each other, they finally decided that the 1st Cavalry Division would take the initiative to find the enemy. In terms of individual combat power, the 1st Cavalry Division was naturally the strongest existence. Only by taking the initiative could they achieve the goal of finding and eliminating the enemy. Okay, our new 2nd Army will take the initiative to cooperate and shrink the encirclement to prevent the enemy from escaping. Shi Bei was very convinced by the 1st Cavalry Division. He also didn't forget how they had given him war horses when he was in trouble. Shi Bei took the initiative to cooperate. Although Lu Zhuo also wanted to lead the troops to gain merit, he also knew that the bigger picture was more important. He immediately made the same promise. Many thanks. Please don't worry, our 1st Cavalry Division won't disappoint you. Tian Hu took the initiative to salute Shi Bei and Lu Zhuo, then strode out of the tent. Not long after, the 1st Cavalry Division's camp was bustling with activity. The army set out and disappeared into the night. 50 miles away from the encirclement of the 5-star army, in a valley called Luoshan Hill, Fong Dingshan, who had already woken up, was looking up at the sky with a worried expression. At this time the sky was already completely dark. There were already many stars in the sky. He still remembered that at this time 2 days ago he had close to 100,000 soldiers and was surrounded by Bugnam of Gojoseon's 2,000 cavalry. Who would have thought that in such a short period of time, the situation would become completely different? 100,000 elite cavalry had been defeated. Now he only had 2,000 men by his side. Moreover, he had already lost his provisions. More importantly, he had lost his morale. How could he win a battle with such an army? Even if he could escape this time, even if the Daizong Emperor spared him, it would be difficult for him to do anything. He had lost his job, lost his army, and wasted countless Baiming's money. How could he still have the face to live in this world? Rather than go back and be looked down upon or even be impeached by others, it would be better to die on the battlefield. Instead, he would leave behind a heroic reputation. His right hand slowly touched the right side of his waist. However, when he touched it, he discovered that the scabbard was still there, but the blade was nowhere to be seen. At this time he remembered that when he was unconscious he felt the weight on his waist loosen. Now that he thought about it, his weapon should have been taken away at that time. Needless to say, this matter was definitely done by Mu Qiong. He probably already knew that he would do something, but what could he say when the other party did it for his own good? AI. With a sigh, Fong Dingshan's eyes lost all color. He was like a walking corpse. At this time he had no hope for the future. Chapter 1342. In a large tent less than 100 meters away from Fong Dingshan, Mu Qiong was discussing the future with several generals. The army had been defeated, and it was not something that could be salvaged by saying anything. The most important thing right now was how to escape from this place. No matter what, they could not be caught. The scouts have already reported that the soldiers who tried to break out during the day have all been captured. From this, it can be seen that the 5-star army has already set up an inescapable net. Even a bird would find it hard to fly out. As the host of the meeting, Mu Qiong stood at the head of the table and sighed as he spoke. His words caused the others in the meeting to lower their heads in silence. They could not escape, and surrendering was also impossible. Doing so would only implicate their loved ones in the capital. Where should they go from here? Seeing that no one spoke, Mu Qiong could guess their thoughts. Then, without any warning, he suddenly asked, "I ask all of you, are you afraid of death?" This question had been discussed countless times since ancient times. Moreover, there was no need to debate the results. Everyone was afraid of death. The only difference was to what extent they were afraid of death, and whether there were things more terrifying than death. Just like the current situation, the army had been defeated, and 100,000 elite cavalry were gone just like that. One could imagine how angry the emperor would be once he knew about this. There were also those civil officials in the court. They looked down on generals like them from the bottom of their hearts, and even privately called them ordinary people. In the past, it was the 5-star army that forced them into a corner. The Daizong emperor wanted to restore the glory of the great Ming dynasty, and wanted to use military power to rule the country. However, now that they had lost the battle, it was time for them to jump out and criticize the emperor. If they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to show their intelligence. If they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to elevate their status and give them enough benefits. What the result was self-evident. If he escaped back, he might be able to survive. However, his life in the future would not be any better than death. Since being alive was no better than being dead, he might as well die. Of course, the prerequisite was that their deaths had to be worth something. No one answered immediately. Instead, everyone raised their heads to look at Mu Qiong as if they wanted to ask something. He did not answer immediately, which gave Mu Qiong some confidence. He knew that he could finally speak his mind now. He cleared his throat and continued, "If everyone is afraid of death, then there's nothing to say. Whether you're willing to surrender or break out of the encirclement, this general will not stop you. However, if you are not afraid of death and are unwilling to give up and still want to fight, this general also has a plan that can work. That is, we will fight our way back to Qin Mountain. After such a long time, I believe that Bugnam of Gojoseon will think that we have escaped far away and will definitely let down his guard. If we suddenly attack and don't give them the time to fire their guns, then it is hard to say who will win and who will lose, but at least we will have a 50% chance of winning. If you can kill Bugnam of Gojoseon, think about it, how great of a meritorious service would that be? Heavens, how is this meritorious service? This is clearly a great service." At this moment, many people sucked in a breath of cold air. Everyone had different expressions, but they quickly calmed down again. When they looked at Mu Qiong, their eyes were filled with excitement as they said, "We are not afraid of death." This showed that they were not afraid of death, which meant that they agreed with Mu Qiong's plan and were determined to fight their way back. Although there would be danger if they went back, wasn't it also more dangerous than breaking out of the encirclement? Since that was the case, why not choose to play a big game? At least if they succeeded, not only would they not be guilty, they would also have a great service. This result was within Mu Qiong's expectations. Now that he finally got a definite answer, he also let out a long sigh of relief and said, "This is good. I can see that everyone is unyielding men. Since that is the case, this general will give the order. We will have a good rest tonight and rush back tomorrow morning. When we suddenly attack at noon, we will definitely be able to kill Bugnam of Gojoseon. At that time, everyone here will become meritorious officials of the great Ming dynasty. It is not impossible for you to be conferred the title of Marquis." The great Ming dynasty had always been conferred the title of Marquis based on military merit. And the title of Marquis was hereditary. It could be imagined that once they were conferred the title, it was equivalent to having a fixed iron rice bowl. In the future, their descendants would be able to enjoy endless benefits. Mu Qiong still had some ability. With just a few words, he stirred up the fighting spirit of the generals. At this moment, they could not wait to appear at the foot of Qin Mountain and kill their way up in one go. If it were not for the fact that the army had not had a good rest these few days, they would probably have done so. Thinking that tomorrow would be the day to show off their skills, the generals excitedly left the main tent and returned to their respective camps to rest. Mu Qiong walked out of the main tent and headed straight to where Fong Dingshan was. Walking over from afar, Mu Qiong looked at the somewhat bleak figure standing there. He took a deep breath and strode forward. Fong Dingshan didn't move when he heard the footsteps behind him. He already knew who they were and even knew what they were planning and discussing. However, he didn't care about it. Even if these people were discussing about surrendering to the 5-star army, he would not find it strange. After all, when facing life and death, a person's true nature would often be revealed. How could a defeated general dare to be brave? At this moment, Fong Dingshan did not ask these subordinates to do anything. Even if these people really wanted to surrender, he would not blame them. However, he would definitely not be with these people. He had received a great favor from the great Ming dynasty, and he could only repay it with his life on the battlefield. General. Mu Qiong walked up and clasped his fists. Haha, the night sky tonight is really beautiful. Looking up at the sky, Fong Dingshan sighed emotionally. Perhaps he did not have long to live, but Fong Dingshan looked at everything so beautifully because it was very likely that he would not see it again in the future. Of course, this did not exclude the possibility that the unpolluted sky was indeed much cleaner than in the future. Yes, the night sky is very beautiful. Mu Qiong agreed. But we will probably see more of this kind of night sky in the future. Perhaps the night sky in the capital will be even more beautiful than here. When he heard the first half of the sentence, Fong Dingshan's expression did not change. However, when he heard the second half, his body suddenly trembled. He had heard many different meanings from these words. What did he mean by, "It will be even more beautiful than here"? What did he mean by, "The night sky in the capital will be even more beautiful than here"? Could it be that Mu Qiong was not prepared to surrender to the enemy? Could it be that he had misunderstood him? While Fong Dingshan was still thinking, Mu Qiong half knelt behind him. General, this subordinate is guilty. This subordinate should not have hidden the counterattack plan from you. This way, everyone will have a slim chance of survival. However, we cannot just leave like this. We must take a gamble. General, please punish us. Mu Qiong had to apologize. Although there were only 2,000 cavalry in the camp, Fong Dingshan was still the great general. Logically speaking, this kind of plan should not have been hidden from him. However, he was worried that his idea would not be approved. In addition, Fong Dingshan seemed to have lost his morale, so he had no choice but to go around him. Now that the plan had been decided, he naturally had to tell the truth. Fong Dingshan had already accepted his fate. He had already prepared himself to borrow a knife and commit suicide the moment Mu Qiong spoke of surrendering. He was sure that the other party would agree to this request. However, he did not expect that they would actually want to counterattack. For a moment, his expression changed continuously. He actually did not react in time. Seeing that Fong Dingshan did not speak, Mu Qiong thought that the other party did not agree. He thought to himself, then continued, "General, our army has been defeated. The emperor will definitely be furious. Since that is the case, why don't we take a gamble? Once we take Bugnam of Gojoseon's head, it will be a great merit. The sacrifice of our 100,000 cavalry will be worth it. General, please grant our wish." I'll grant your wish." At this moment, Fong Dingshan really wanted to shout loudly. However, because he was too emotional, he could not say anything. Fong Dingshan still did not speak. Mu Qiong was somewhat disappointed. He even looked down on Fong Dingshan a little. Civil officials would advise to the death, while military officials would fight to the death. This seemed to be a matter of course. As a great general, he had to be prepared to die on the battlefield at any time. How could he be afraid? Mu Qiong sighed in his heart. When they were discussing the military plan, he did not call Fong Dingshan. Now that the situation had changed, there was no need to care about Fong Dingshan's attitude. In any case, he was going to give it his all. Seeing that he did not receive a response, he simply turned and left. Instead of explaining, he might as well take the opportunity to sleep a little more. That way he would have a better mind for the battle tomorrow. Fong Dingshan finally recovered. When he found out that his general was not going to surrender but was going to fight to the death, he was extremely happy. Now he only wanted to get on the horse and fight with everyone. Speaking of which, his martial arts were not bad. However, when he wanted to look for Mu Qiong, he found that he was no longer there. After asking the bodyguard standing not far away, he found out that Mu Qiong had returned to his tent to sleep. Forget it, let him rest for a night. This general will explain to him tomorrow morning. I also want to have a good sleep. Fong Dingshan was in a good mood. He was very much in favor of the military plan to counterattack and rush back to Chiun Mountain. This was the only way he could fight with his life. The knot in his heart was untied. When Fong Dingshan entered the tent, he was still a little excited. Most of the night passed. When it was almost dawn, he fell asleep in a daze. Less than an hour after he fell asleep, suddenly the sound of war drums rang out. It woke him up abruptly. Then he heard panicked shouts. Enemy attack, get up quickly. Chapter 1343. At this time, outside the big tent of the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong cavalry, bright red five-star flags stood in great numbers. Looking from afar, the dense cavalry had already surrounded this temporary stronghold in all directions. The 1st Cavalry Division didn't rest for the whole night. Instead, they were constantly searching for traces of the enemy. Finally, when it was almost dawn, they found a large stronghold. The commander of the 5th Cavalry Division, Gong Feng, who was in charge of searching this area, ordered his men to heavily surround this place. Gong Feng did not give the order to attack immediately. He had already made a rough calculation. There were only about 2,000 northern Ming cavalrymen that were surrounded. He had led 5 regiments of 4,000 elite cavalrymen. In terms of numbers, he had twice the number of the enemy. In terms of combat strength, he was full of confidence. What was there to be brave about? What was there to be afraid of? In the previous telegram, Yang Qindong emphasized that these original Baiming Liaodong cavalry were all elites. They had consumed a lot of money and food from the Baiming Emperor to create them. If they could be used as their own, it would save a lot of training time. Wasn't the 1st Cavalry Division going to be expanded by a division? Excellent soldiers were essential. If they captured these Baiming cavalry, it would save a lot of effort. Gong Feng, who had his own plans, didn't immediately attack. He wanted to take a look and carefully observe these Baiming cavalry. He wanted to see if they had the qualifications to become soldiers of the world's #1 cavalry army. He wanted to properly lock them up. As for whether or not these people would be able to escape from his hands, Gong Feng was even less worried. He had brought along the elite soldiers of the 5th Regiment, and he still had many excellent Big Dipper crossbows in his hands that he had yet to use. If these people were really very brave, not to mention other things, if a wave of crossbows were released, would he still be afraid that they would be able to overturn the sky? Even if they didn't have 7-star crossbows with the 1st Cavalry Division's elite cavalry, how could they be afraid of these 2,000 Baiming cavalry? Gong Feng's face was full of pride and confidence, but when he spoke, he didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating the enemy. Men, surround this place. Don't be careless. I believe everyone understands the principle of cornered beasts fighting. Battalion commanders, go do it. Yes. The 10 battalion commanders immediately gave a standard military salute before turning around and heading back to their respective units. The camp was completely surrounded. When Fang Dingshan, Mu Qiong, and the others woke up from their tents, this was the scene that greeted them. They were surrounded by the cavalry of the 5-star army. Not far away there was a large flag that was fluttering in the wind. The words 1st Cavalry Division of the World were written on it. Their expressions became somewhat unsightly. In the past, Fang Dingshan thought that his Baiming Liaodong cavalry was the best cavalry in the world, and that no one could match them. Naturally, he had done a detailed investigation on the elite cavalry of the 5-star army. He had naturally heard of the reputation of the 1st Cavalry Division. All this while, Fang Dingshan's wish was to find the 1st Cavalry Division and fight them. He wanted to see who was the strongest cavalry in the world. However, because the other party had been fighting in the inner region, he hadn't found a suitable opportunity. Now he finally met them, and under such circumstances he couldn't help but curse his bad luck. Why did they have to meet the 1st Cavalry Division when they were defeated? This way, this battle wouldn't be fair at all, and it would be extremely difficult to win. Especially when he saw that the other party's troops were in formation and had already surrounded them, Fang Dingshan had a bad feeling. In comparison, Mu Qiong didn't think too much. Perhaps this was the difference between a general and a deputy general. He didn't have the ability to see through the entire battle. He was only thinking about how to get out of here, because if they couldn't get out, they wouldn't be able to launch a surprise attack on Qiyun Mountain, and they wouldn't be able to make a last stand. Men, charge out. If we're lucky enough to get out, we'll gather at the foot of Qiyun Mountain. Mu Qiong was afraid that if this dragged on, their forces would fall to a freezing point, so he quickly gave the order to charge. As soon as he gave the order, the other Baiming Liaodong cavalry mounted their horses and raised their sabers. They let out a battle cry and charged in all directions without any pattern. This shocked Fang Dingshan. He didn't have enough troops to begin with, and now that they were charging in such a disorderly manner, how could they possibly win the battle? He couldn't help but cry out in alarm. Don't charge. Everyone retreat. Retreat. Fang Dingshan's original intention was for the entire army to retreat, reorganize, and charge in one direction. With the 2,000 elite Baiming Liaodong cavalry, it was very possible for them to charge out. However, charging in such a disorderly manner was not advisable. However, no one could understand his thoughts, especially when Mu Qiong had misunderstood him. Seeing that the army was charging and Fang Dingshan was still shouting non-stop, Mu Qiong's eyes flashed with anger. What's wrong? Are you still thinking of surrendering at this time? Since you don't have any backbone, don't blame me. With this thought in mind, Mu Qiong's right hand suddenly made a sound and the cavalry saber suddenly slashed towards Fang Dingshan's back. This was Fang Dingshan's fault. He wanted to explain what happened last night, so he purposely got closer to Mu Qiong. However, because he was too close, he didn't even have time to react when Mu Qiong suddenly attacked. His entire back was hit and the intense pain caused him to lose all his strength. He couldn't stop himself from falling off his horse. This sudden scene shocked all of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. They didn't think that there would be internal strife before the battle even began. However, Mu Qiong's reaction wasn't slow either. He shouted, Fang Dingshan wants to surrender to the 5-star army. My soldiers and I are loyal soldiers. How can we allow such a thing to happen? From now on, if anyone dares to talk about surrendering, they will be like this person. Come, charge out. Fang Dingshan's martial arts were quite good. He was able to become the Imperial Guard commander of the substitute emperor. He had good martial arts. In the past few years he had trained his horse skills quite a bit. His strength had increased by a lot. If they were face to face, Mu Qiong probably wouldn't be able to last more than 3 rounds. However, after a successful sneak attack, Fang Dingshan was seriously injured. This scene was also heard by the other Baiming Liaodong cavalry. They knew that their general's strength was far inferior to theirs. Even when their general wanted to surrender, he ended up like this. How could they dare to have any other thoughts? After learning from the previous example, the other Baiming Liaodong cavalry weren't willing to give up their lives. After they woke up from their shock, they yelled and charged towards the neatly arranged 1st Cavalry Division's 5-star army. Prepare the crossbows. Try not to kill people. Focus on injuring people. Fire the crossbows. Commander Gong Feng, who was riding on his horse, commanded loudly. Following his order, a series of 7-star crossbows were fired at a flat angle. Their target was the first batch of Baiming Liaodong cavalry. The ancient people used bows to test their arm strength and eyesight. Especially arm strength. If they didn't have enough strength, they wouldn't be able to fully draw the bow. Naturally, the power would be limited. Even if they could fully draw the bow, they would only feel tired after shooting 1 arrow. They would need to rest for a while before shooting the 2nd arrow. As the elites of the cavalry, they naturally wouldn't be so weak that they could only shoot 1 arrow. They could usually shoot 3 arrows in a row before their arms would feel numb and sore. There were even those who were born with great strength who could shoot 4 or 5 arrows. Just like the legendary Hou Yi, he was a person who could shoot 9 arrows in a row. In the eyes of archers, he was a powerful existence. To use a bow, one must have enough arm strength. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very effective. However, with the continuous development of technology like the appearance of the 7-star crossbow, shooting arrows became simple. One only needed to load the front of the crossbow and pull the bow to fully draw it once. Then 7 arrows could be shot. This saved a lot of effort and had great power. Facing such a tyrannical weapon, how could the Baiming Liaodong cavalry block it? With just the sound of the trigger being pulled, the crossbow bolts rained down like rain. The 500 northern Ming Liaodong cavalry charging at the front were all shot down by the crossbow bolts. The seemingly powerful attack also stopped because of this. Then their morale plummeted. This also caused the hundreds of Baiming Liaodong cavalry who were preparing to charge to stop. They were humans, not gods. Facing arrows that could take their lives, they had to show hesitation. This hesitation caused their morale to plummet. The Baiming Liaodong cavalry, who were still red-eyed and wanted to charge, had their combat power reduced by more than a level. This scene was also seen by Mu Qiong, who was behind them. From the moment he slashed Fang Dingshan with his saber, he had already gone crazy. Now that he saw that the front troops were injured and the middle troops were not moving forward, he was immediately enraged. Come on, charge with me. Mu Qiong was afraid that their morale would drop and they would lose the opportunity to charge out of the encirclement. He was prepared to charge himself and set an example. Come. Gong Feng also let out a loud cry. When he saw another armored general charge out from the enemy camp with less than 200 men beside him, he also laughed out loud and leaped forward. As Gong Feng rushed out, A battalion of 400 cavalrymen followed behind him. Their duty was to protect the safety of their commander. Gong Fengchong had his reasons. Just like how the northern Ming Liaodong cavalry always wanted to have a direct PK with the world's first cavalry division, how could they not have this idea? Now that the opportunity had finally appeared, Gong Feng immediately seized it and leapt out. One side had 400 people while the other side had 200. Although there was a difference in numbers, it wasn't too big. If the Baiming Liaodong cavalry were really elite, they could make up for this difference. Just like how the 1st Cavalry Division dared to attack thousands of enemy cavalry with only a few hundred people. Chapter 1344. Both sides had a total of more than 600 people, and they quickly approached each other under the urging of their war horses. It was a battle of life and death, which attracted everyone's attention. It could be imagined that if Mu Qiong won, the Baiming Liaodong cavalry's morale would be greatly boosted, and they would be able to unleash 100% of their strength and break out of the encirclement. On the other hand, if Gong Fengxing won, the rest of the northern Ming dynasty's Liaodong cavalry would probably all surrender. This would save them from a battle of weapons and blood. Both sides had their own goals, and they quickly approached each other before clashing. Mu Qiong, who was the first to charge, chose Gong Feng as his target. He had already noticed that this person was different from ordinary people, and he was wearing a flashy black battle robe. Based on his experience, he should be the commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division, and if he could take down this person, it would definitely be a heavy blow to the 5-star army's morale, and it would be much easier to win. Gong Feng also targeted Mu Qiong, although he didn't know who this person was and didn't know his true identity. But judging from the armor he was wearing, his position shouldn't be too low. Only by severely injuring such a person would he be able to give the Baiming Liaodong cavalry enough respect and threat, which was what he wanted. Both of them had the same goal, and this caused the moment they met each other, the collision of their sabers caused a heart-trembling sound. Dang dang dang. In just one exchange, both of them slashed out 3 times, and then their bodies shook and their horses moved to the side. The outcome of the first round was actually a draw. This was out of everyone's expectations. The difference was that Mu Qiong revealed a shocked expression. He was a famous general among the 100,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry. Other than General Fang Dingshan and Deputy General Luo Baikuan, he didn't put anyone else in his eyes when it came to fighting. It was the same when he faced Gong Feng. In his opinion, with his strength, it wasn't impossible to take down this person in one round. But who would have thought that he wouldn't be able to do anything? Gong Feng's ability was out of Mu Qiong's expectations, and his original confidence began to fade rapidly. He began to suspect that he couldn't break out of the encirclement and leave this place. In comparison, Gong Feng's eyes were filled with fighting spirit. Yang Qindong had said more than once that there was always someone better out there. There was no such thing as the strongest. In the past, Gong Feng didn't really approve of them, especially when their opponents were Baiming cavalry. He didn't even put them in his eyes. How could these people, whose legs turned to jelly the moment they saw the Mongolian cavalry, be a match for him? And just now, after the exchange with Mu Qiong, he realized that there were also powerful people in the Baiming army. This reignited his fighting spirit. While he stopped looking down on his opponent, his left hand unconsciously reached for his waist. There was a saber there. It was the dual saber technique that everyone in the 1st Cavalry Division had to learn. It could be used to win and save lives at critical moments. The two of them rode back. Regardless of whether they were willing or not, another clash had begun. As the war horses of both sides continued to accelerate, the distance between them grew closer and closer. Soon after, the sound of collisions could be heard again. In a short period of time, Mu Qiong had continuously slashed out 3 times with his saber. The first 2 of the 3 slashes were still a clash. Their strengths were equally matched. But when it came to the 3rd slash, Gong Feng seemed to have no strength to attack. He changed from slashing to blocking. Gong Feng seemed to be exhausted. When Mu Qiong saw this, he was naturally overjoyed. He originally thought that his opponent was a fierce man. If that was the case, it would be difficult for him to win. If he wasn't careful, he might even lose his life here. But this 3rd slash had reignited his hope. He used all his strength and slashed out a 4th time when the 2 horses were about to cross paths. He wanted to see how he would block the fourth slash if he already had to block the third slash. Mu Qiong had a confident smile on his face, as if victory was already in sight. But this smile quickly froze on his face. Because when he slashed out for the fourth time he suddenly felt a pain in his back. Because of this, more than half of the strength in his body dissipated. The saber that he forcefully slashed out only hit the edge of Gongfeng's saber before it bounced back. This was all thanks to the fact that the two horses had already separated. Otherwise, if Gongfeng counterattacked while he was injured, Mu Qiong wouldn't have been able to escape even if he wanted to. The two horses separated for the second time. The distance between them increased. When they reached a certain point, Gongfeng turned his horse around. At this moment his eyes were glowing. Just now he had drawn his other saber and attacked Mu Qiong with his left saber. This also meant that his next opponent was only a disabled person. Naturally he was full of confidence. He wanted to see how his opponent would fare in the next clash. Gongfeng was in high spirits. He was ready for the next clash. Mu Qiong's expression was much worse. The back of his waist was still bleeding. His strength was also fading. If he didn't have great willpower he might have already fallen off his horse. Mu Qiong forced himself to take a deep breath and recover his energy. As he turned his horse around he also tore off a piece of his battle robe and wrapped it around his waist. Although this was of limited use it could at least slow down the flow of blood. This gave him the strength to fight again. Charge! After feeling better and regaining some of his strength, Mu Qiong shouted again and charged in Gongfeng's direction. When two armies fought there would naturally be chaos. Most of the time it would be a chaotic battle. This depended on the strength of each army and their understanding of formations. But in a chaotic battle, everyone was in danger. After all, no one knew where a saber would suddenly come from and take your life. Thus, luck played a large part in a big battle. This was also why most generals wouldn't take the initiative to charge. If they were unlucky and were struck by a saber the moment they charged into the enemy camp, wouldn't they die an unjust death? As for the battle between the generals of both sides, that was even more impossible. Think about how difficult it was to nurture a general. Why would they waste it in a one-on-one battle? That was only done in movies and TV dramas to create a tense and exciting atmosphere. But now the real scene was really happening. Gongfeng and Mu Qiong were really in a one-on-one battle to the death. The other warriors and soldiers also saw this but no one went to stop him. Perhaps they had been warned before, or perhaps they were full of confidence in their general. Since no one stopped them, Mu Qiong could only brace himself and charge forward. If it was any other time he could retreat if he was injured and no one would say anything. But now he was Baiming the Liaodong cavalry's morale was tied to him. If he was defeated and retreated the result could be imagined. There would be no chance for a comeback. In order to survive, in order to appear at the foot of Qiyun Mountain and deal a fatal blow to Yang Chendong, Mu Qiong was going all out. Ayaya! He shouted loudly as if he wanted to convey all his strength through his mouth. Mu Qiong was getting closer and closer to Gongfeng. Then he raised his saber high and slashed down from the sky. At this time Mu Qiong had given up on defense. He only cared about attacking. Even if he died he would severely injure Gongfeng to prove his strength. Gongfeng was not frightened by the other party's shouting. On the contrary, he stopped his warhorse. He did not want to give the other party a chance to turn back. The other party was already injured. Next it was time for him to expand his victory. Relying on the horse's momentum and speed, Mu Qiong saber strike was not weak. With just one strike he was able to bend Gongfeng's body, who had raised his saber to block. Mu Qiong's face flashed with a full smile. He was confident that he now had the upper hand. Next, as long as the other party relaxed he would be able to cut Gongfeng in half. But when he still had that smile on his face his abdomen hurt again. Another saber appeared and slashed in front of him. At this moment Mu Qiong finally knew how he was injured but it was too late. When blood flew out in front of and behind him he had less than 20% of his strength left. It was already extremely difficult for him to stand on his horse. How could he have the strength to fight to the death? Due to the excessive blood loss, Mu Qiong's body became weak and his vision became blurry. Mu Qiong could vaguely see a blade coming towards the door. He instinctively wanted to dodge but his reaction was already very slow. Just as he moved his head slightly, the blade had already landed on his neck. His aorta was cut open and blood spurted out. With a plop, Mu Qiong, who had no strength left, fell off his horse. He fell to the ground and twitched for a moment before he stopped breathing. Mu Qiong was dead. He died under Gong Feng's 2 sabers. And the moment he fell to the ground, Gong Feng had already bent over and stood up. His head was still covered in blood in his hand. A loud shout immediately rang out on the battlefield. The enemy general is dead. Do you still want to continue struggling? Surrender and you will be spared. Surrender and you'll be spared. The 4,000 brave soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division also shouted in unison. The 4,000 people shouted in unison, giving one a feeling of covering the sun. In that instant, some of the more cowardly Baiming Liaodong cavalry already couldn't help but throw away the sabers in their hands. Their faces were filled with horror. On the battlefield, there weren't many left of the 200 cavalry Mu Qiong brought. They didn't have enough troops to begin with and their morale was low. How could they be a match for the 5-star army's cavalry? Not to mention, after a series of fierce battles, many Baiming Liaodong cavalry's sabers were already broken in half. They couldn't pose any threat or harm to the enemy at all. How could they possibly win without even having weapons? This was where the 5-star army's strength lay. This was especially true for an elite cavalry troop like the 1st Cavalry Division. The sabers in their hands were all forged in the Crimson City's arsenal. Be it in terms of sharpness or toughness, they were far superior to other swords. Chapter 1345. Perhaps nothing could be seen at the beginning of the collision, but after a long time, it was very common for weapons to break. The soldiers were brave, the weapons were elite, and the rewards and punishments were clear. It was hard to find anyone who could be a match for such a team. Shouts rang out from all directions. With every shout, the 4,500 cavalrymen would take a step forward. Under this kind of intimidation, killing intent surged forth. More and more northern Ming Liaodong cavalrymen threw their weapons to the ground. There were even some who were frightened by this momentum and had already dismounted and knelt on the ground, acting as if they were surrendering. Mu Qiong was killed and his head was cut off. Now it was on Gong Feng's cavalry sword. Fang Dingshan was injured and fell to the ground. He could no longer ride or command the army. Without their commander, the northern Ming Liaodong cavalry finally saw the situation clearly. They knew that they had lost the upper hand. Immediately, more and more of them threw down their weapons and surrendered. Of the 2,000 cavalry, 600 were killed or injured. The rest surrendered. After surrendering, Gong Feng knew what kind of big fish he had encountered this time. He had killed the 3rd fierce general of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry, Mu Qiong, and captured the Baiming general Fang Dingshan. This was definitely a great achievement. Laughing heartily, Gong Feng immediately ordered the scouts to spread the news in all directions. After that, he brought the 5 regiments of warriors and personally escorted the 1,600 northern Ming cavalrymen to the main camp. The poor Fang Dingshan was being carried under a simple stretcher. The wounds on his body had been treated and he was no longer bleeding. His mouth was also stuffed with a piece of cloth that someone had used before and it smelled very bad. This was not to humiliate him, but to prevent him from biting his tongue and committing suicide. On Qian Mountain, Yang Chendong and 2,000 Black Knight Dragon Guards had already finished cleaning up the battlefield. An incomparably huge dying monastery and more than 10 smaller dying monasteries had already been built. There were simply too many severed heads. It was impossible to put them all together, so they could only be divided into a dozen or so. However, it was precisely because of this that it gave off a very frightening feeling from afar. It was as if there were countless severed heads. When Division Commander Tian, who brought the 1st Star Army to the foot of Qian Mountain, he saw this scene. At this moment, even Division Commander Tian, who had killed countless people and never feared any enemy, had a shocked expression. He could no longer count the number of heads in front of him. Were these all killed by the Black Cavalry? They only had 2,000 people. How did they do it? Even if they used firearms, it was 2,000 against 100,000. If they were careless and the enemy cavalry charged up the mountain, the consequences would be very serious. Although he had always been modest on the surface, Tian, who was very prideful deep down, he believed that no one in the 5-star army was a match for them in terms of cold weapons. Even the Black Cavalry by his teacher's side was only on par with them. But now this thought had to change. The Black Cavalry was the Black Cavalry. It was not something that the 1st Cavalry Division could compare to. In just this battle alone they had killed tens of thousands of enemies. Their opponent was the Baiming Liaodong Cavalry. They were the most elite existence in the Baiming army, and could be compared to the Imperial Army in the capital. This was because the Black Cavalry's main mission was to protect Yangqindong and did not have many opportunities to kill enemies. If they were like the 1st Cavalry Division and participated in every battle, their achievements would be much greater than his. Tian Hu had a frightened expression, but he did not think that it was precisely because the Baiming Liaodong Cavalry that they had strict military discipline that they left tens of thousands of corpses here. If it was any other Baiming army, most of the people would have run away as soon as the guns were fired. How could they kill so many people? On the mountain, Yangqindong had already seen Tian Hu's army appear. At this point he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Yangqindong was a little nervous. This was not because he was afraid that the enemy would return. With the firearms and ammunition prepared on the mountain, it would not be a problem if 100,000 enemies came. He was nervous because he did not want to kill more Han soldiers. Before he had no choice. It was either you die or I die. Of course he had to protect himself. Now that Tian Hu had appeared here with his army, it was enough to prove that the situation was settled. At least he did not have to kill Han soldiers. This was enough to let him breathe a sigh of relief. After Tian Hu arrived and saw Yangqindong on the mountain, his expression became more respectful and he greeted his teacher. Yangqindong could guess that Tian Hu must have been shaken by the news. This was also good. He could remind him from time to time so that he would not become arrogant. Therefore, in the following time he did not introduce too much about the Battle of Qiyun Mountain. Instead he lightly skimmed over it. He only said that the Black Cavalry risked their lives and Baiming Liaodong Cavalry could not withstand a single blow. However, these words in Tian Hu's ears made him even more frightened. The Baiming Liaodong Cavalry was the elite Baiming army. How could they not withstand a single blow? Didn't this show the strength of his teacher and the Black Cavalry under his feet? The battle on the mountain was skimmed over. Yangqindong mainly asked about the situation below the mountain. After learning that nearly 50,000 Baiming Liaodong Cavalry had been captured, he nodded his head in satisfaction. Good, this battle was well fought. Weren't you worried about the lack of soldiers when you expanded the army? Now that you have tens of thousands of people, the problem can be solved. Yes, student, thanks teacher. Tian Hu's face was filled with joy after hearing this. He believed that after the 1st Cavalry Division was expanded, its combat strength would definitely increase by a large level. The victory of the Battle of Qiyun Mountain meant that Baiming's military forces would completely withdraw from the grasslands. Moreover, for a certain period of time, they would not have the opportunity and ability to provoke the 5-star army. With the defeat of the 100,000 Baiming Liaodong Cavalry, the 100,000 infantrymen led by Gao Yu in front of the beginning city became turtles in a jar. The Baiming Liaodong Cavalry was defeated and captured. The 70,000 reinforcements sent by Tulu City were cut off and surrounded. The Tulu City's defenders retreated. Only 10,000 of the 50,000 soldiers escaped. Nearly 40,000 soldiers were captured and a large amount of provisions and military supplies were seized. This battle could be said to be a crushing defeat for the Baiming army. At this time, Gao Yu did not know about this. He was still anxiously waiting for the reinforcements to appear. With a heart full of fighting spirit, when Gao Yu led the army out of Tulu City, everything was so smooth. Taking down Saihan Mountain and attacking the outer city of the beginning city gave him the feeling that the 5-star army was just SOSO. As long as he attacked with all his strength, he could achieve great success. At that time, it would not be difficult for him to be conferred the title of Marquis. At that time he was full of confidence and seemed to have endless strength in everything he did. But then there was a sudden change in the battle. The 5-star army suddenly launched a counterattack. Like a thunder from the sky, he was completely shocked and stunned. Countless cavalrymen of the 5-star army seemed to have emerged from the ground and surrounded them. Any infantrymen who dared to rush out were either killed or captured. After several attempts, and after losing more than 10,000 soldiers, Gao Yu finally became obedient. Gao Yu, who was surrounded, could only put his hope on the reinforcements at this moment. He thought in his heart that there were still 100,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry and 100,000 infantrymen who had not appeared. He still had the ability to turn the situation around. While constantly strengthening the defense of the camp, he hoped for the reinforcements to appear. But soon 5 days passed and he did not see any reinforcements. What was worse was that there was not much food left in the camp. The front line's attack was too smooth and Gao Yu was a bit arrogant. The speed of the march was too fast and the logistics could not keep up. Now the weakness of the lack of food was finally exposed. There were more than 100,000 soldiers, and there were also tens of thousands of injured soldiers. If there was no food to eat, there was no need for the 5-star army to attack. Gao Yu would not be able to survive. This kind of predicament made his face extremely ugly. He had been sitting in the tent until it was almost dark. Then a soldier came to report that the messenger of the 5-star army had arrived and they had something to say. The war is not over, it is not over. Hearing that the messenger of the 5-star army appeared at this time, Gao Yu angrily shouted. As long as the reinforcements arrived, he could still play with the center of the camp. This was what he was counting on. After shouting for a while, the anger in his heart was almost vented. Li Keguang and Zhou Xian, who were standing next to him, looked at each other and nodded. Li Keguang lightly coughed and said, "Military supervisor, since they are here, why don't we meet them? Our great Ming is a nation of etiquette." "That's right, even if we meet them we can't lose a piece of meat. If they say something unpleasant we can just kick them out of the tent. There's no need to get angry over them." Zhou Xianxia also smiled as he expressed his opinion. The two generals were trying to persuade him and Gao Yu's face gradually became calm. "Hey, then I'll give you two some face and meet them. I want to see what they have to say." Gao Yu's face was normal and he couldn't help but straighten his body. At this moment he still paid attention to his appearance. Perhaps in his heart he still thought that he represented the Baiming Celestial Empire and that the 5-star army was nothing more than Bugnam of Gojoseon's personal product. How could a king be compared to an emperor? Li Keguang and Zhou Xiangjie hurriedly gave a look to the guard who entered the tent to report. The guard immediately nodded and retreated. Not long after, a young man wearing a green military uniform with 2 bars and 4 stars on his chest walked into the tent with his head held high and his chest puffed out. The person who came in was 8 feet tall. As soon as he entered the tent, he was like an iron tower that blocked the light coming in from outside, giving people a very imposing feeling. At this moment, Gao Yu suddenly had a feeling of darkness in front of his eyes, which made him very unhappy. He opened his mouth and said impatiently, "Who is it? What business do you have with this military supervisor?" Chapter 1346. The person who came was the new 1031 ST Division's commander, Gong Pingju. This time he was ordered by Commander Qin Feng to deliver a message to Gao Yu. Since the other party had already lost contact with the outside world, they needed to explain the situation and shatter the other party's illusions. "Army Supervisor Gao, I am the commander of 1031st Division Gong Pingju. I am here to deliver a message to Army Supervisor Gao." Gong Pingju's voice was solemn. There was no other expression on his face. There was no so-called arrogance or flattery. Gao Reng was very satisfied with Gong Pingju's attitude. What he was most afraid of was the other party's arrogance. Although he was at a disadvantage now, he still had hundreds of thousands of soldiers in his hands. If the other party's attitude was too arrogant, how could he tolerate it? "Speak." Since the other party's attitude was not bad, Gao Yu was also interested to hear what they had to say. At this time not only Gao Yu, but even Li Keguang and Zhou Xiangjie pricked up their ears. Intuition told them that the messenger of the 5-star army must have something important to say. When a pin drop could be heard in the tent, Gong Pingju's voice was loud and clear. "Army Supervisor Gao, just a day ago, Liao Dong's 100,000 cavalry were surrounded and annihilated by Bugnam of Gojoseon. Fang Dingshan was captured, Luo Baikuan, Mu Qiong and others died in battle. 3 days ago our 5-star army captured Tulu City. Apart from the 10,000 soldiers who escaped to Wanquan City, the other 110,000 soldiers were captured. In other words, you are already a lone army in the grasslands. If my king's guess is correct, you don't have much food left. Considering that we are all Han, out of humanitarian reasons, your wounded soldiers can be sent out of the camp. We will arrange for people to receive them and treat them." At this time, Gao Yu's face was already very red. Intuition told him that the other party's words could be true, but he would never admit it verbally. Fang Dingshan's 100,000 Liaodong cavalry were so powerful. How could they be destroyed so easily? They must be lying to him. In a fit of anger, Gao Yu suddenly shouted, "Impossible, this is impossible. You must be trying to shake our morale, so you spread such rumors here." In the face of Gao Yu's yelling, Gong Pingju shook his head in disappointment. This time, if the Baiming army didn't listen to Gao Yu's words and took the initiative to attack, it would have taken a lot of effort to deal with them. It could also be said that Gao Yu was at least 80% responsible for this defeat. Gong Pingju, who revered the strong, naturally looked down on all these actions. However, he wasn't going to remind the enemy out of kindness. Thus he just shook his head and cupped his fist. "Inspector Gao, you don't have to believe me. I'm here to report this news to you. As for the wounded, it's best to hand them over. Otherwise, not only will they be unable to fight, they will also consume your limited food. It's really meaningless." Gong Pingju didn't wait for Gao Yu to make a decision. He turned around and left. His goal had been achieved and his mission was completed. As for what would happen next, he believed that as long as Gao Yu wasn't stupid, he would definitely hand over the wounded. Gong Pingju had already left. Gao Yu, who was left in the tent, had a stupefied expression. Before the messenger came, he still had some hope and ideas in his heart. But now all of these thoughts were shattered. He suddenly realized that he was like a clown. He had become someone who had been abandoned. No. She had made the wrong decision and abandoned herself. Who was the 5-star army? If they were so easy to deal with, how could they drive Yeshin's world of Wara out of the grassland? If they were so easy to deal with, why were Annan and other countries, including the small Japanese Empire and North Korea, occupied by them? To think that he thought he was so powerful that he wanted to destroy the 5-star army. Now hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, captured and surrounded. And all of this was because he gave the order to attack and leave the city. He was already a sinner through the ages. He could imagine how the officials and censors in the court would accuse him once the news reached Baiming's capital. The Daizong Emperor would hate him so much that even if he died now, it wouldn't be enough to make up for his crimes. Thinking that her life was completely ruined like this, Gao Yu's face was full of tears at this moment. She lay on the desk and cried loudly. This scene was seen clearly by Li Keguang and Zhou Xian. This wasn't good news for them. Originally, he thought that by following behind Gao Yu with this army of hundreds of thousands, in addition to Gao Yu's background in the palace, this trip would be gilded. Once he achieved military merits, he would be willing to spend money and return with an official position. How wonderful would that be? But now, Gao Yu's army had been defeated. Not only that, from the tone of the 5-star army's commander, their entire army of 400,000 was finished. What military merits did they have now? All that was left was a life-and-death crisis. A gentleman wouldn't stand under a collapsing wall. Although these two couldn't be considered gentlemen, they knew that life was precious. In order to survive, people like them were willing to do anything. While Gao Yu was still crying, Li Keguang and Zhou Xianxia had already quietly left the tent. Not long after, the two met in a small tent. They dismissed everyone, and when there was no one else around, they no longer had any misgivings and spoke of their worries. Since they were vile people, they didn't have any so-called righteousness or loyalty in their eyes. They only cared about benefits in their lives. In the end, the two of them discussed and decided that in order to survive, they could only do something that would let down Gao Yu. If that didn't work, they would capture this person and surrender to the 5-star army. At the very least, they had to save their lives first. Due to their lack of understanding of the 5-star army, the two of them didn't immediately make this decision. First of all, they didn't fully believe Gong Pingju's words. What if the other party was lying to them? What if the reinforcements really appeared? Second of all, they wanted to see if the 5-star army really didn't kill captives. If that was the case, it wouldn't be too late for them to choose to surrender. Gong Pingju left. Although he didn't get a reply from Gao Yu, at least the 100,000 Baiming army that were surrounded had become obedient. Since there were no breakthroughs, it was obvious that their actions were effective. Naturally, this couldn't be separated from the secret agents that the intelligence agency had arranged in the Baiming army. They were either ordinary soldiers or sergeants or centurions. They didn't look very eye-catching. If the Baiming army's battle went smoothly, even if they said something unfavorable to the army, it wouldn't have any effect. But the sound of the wind and rain was completely different. Oftentimes, a single straw could overwhelm a camel at this time. Commander of Wanquan. Information about the situation on the front line was constantly sent here. The fast horse scouts, the secret agents, the intelligence personnel of the Genie Guards, and the soldiers of the East Faction Guards were all active. Through their various efforts, in addition to the fact that Yang Qindong had no intention of covering up the news, some of the true situations were sent to Marquis Wuqing Shiheng, who was in charge of the formation here. At first, when he learned that Gao Yu's army was defeated, Shiheng still had a trace of joy in his heart. You want to jump over me to take over the leadership? Now you've suffered a defeat. Now you know why Marquis hasn't sent troops. The front line lost the battle, at least it proved that he was right. With this, Shiheng ate an extra bowl of rice when he was eating. However, when the bad news came back, he lost his appetite. This was especially true when he learned that Talu City had been taken down by the 5 Astral Army. Of the 100,000 soldiers in the city, only 10,000 had managed to escape. The rest had been taken captive by the 5 Astral Army. He felt that the situation had spiraled out of control. Then when he heard that even the 100,000 Liaodong cavalry led by Fong Dingshan was defeated by the 5-star army, and half of them were killed and the other half were captured, Shiheng's face completely changed. As someone who knew the situation in the army very well, Shiheng knew the importance of the Liaodong cavalry better than anyone else. The Great Ming dynasty lacked horses and people who were good at riding. Otherwise, how could they have watched the Tatars and Walla dominate the grasslands? Even when Gaozu was alive, although he had conquered the grasslands several times and forced the Mongolian cavalry to flee, if one looked carefully, one could still find that they won because of the bravery of the soldiers, the courage of the generals, the help of firearms, and the advantage of military strength. More often than not, they used hundreds of thousands to fight against tens of thousands of Mongolian cavalry. In the end, wasn't it because they didn't have enough war horses and too few cavalry? Now that they finally had 100,000 cavalry, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that this was the foundation of Baiming's existence on the grasslands. It was because of these 100,000 cavalry that they dared to participate in the war. From time to time, they would cause trouble for the 5-star army to show their existence. If there was an opportunity, they would even bravely attack and give the 5-star army a head-on blow. This was the magic of cavalry. On the vast grasslands, they could come and go without a trace. They could use the shortest amount of time and the smallest price to do many things they wanted to do. Without these cavalry, they could only rely on their legs. There was no need to fight a war. Often they would be tired to death. How could they cause trouble for others? What's with this Fong Dingshan? Shiheng shook his head in confusion. From the bottom of his heart, he admired Fong Dingshan very much. Although Fong Dingshan was a little greedy, he was forced to do so by the general situation. The atmosphere in northern Ming was like this. If one wanted to be a good official, he had to be filial to the academy. Otherwise, he would be dismissed. This was a common problem for Baiming and even southern Ming officials. It wasn't a problem. Moreover, Fong Dingshan was indeed good at fighting. Chapter 1347. Furthermore, this person also had a unique ability in training cavalry. Otherwise, how could he create 100,000 elite cavalry in such a short period of time? This was 100,000 cavalry. How could they be surrounded by the 5-star army and be so heavily injured? Could it be that if they couldn't win, they wouldn't run? How could Shiheng know that this wasn't a problem of running or not? Instead, Fong Dingshan thought that the opportunity had arrived and took the initiative to send himself to his death. If not, even if Yang Qindong personally took action, he would have to pay a huge price and time to deal with them. No matter what, Fong Dingshan had really lost. This was a huge matter. Thinking that his responsibility was about to become huge, Shiheng sat in front of the desk and started to write a memorial. He wanted to report this matter to the emperor and request for the emperor to send capable people to stabilize the situation in the Wanquan capital department. He also wanted to ask the imperial court for soldiers and salaries. Otherwise, if the 5-star army really attacked, how could he stop them? An urgent report was sent to the capital at the speed of 800 li. At this moment, the Baiming army was handing over 10,000 injured Han soldiers to the 5-star army. It was laughable to say that these injured soldiers were the products of the 5-star army's cavalry. Now they needed the enemy's help to treat them. This also caused many of the injured soldiers to be filled with worry. They really didn't know what was going to happen to them. As the other Ming soldiers received the military order, they couldn't resist. They could only watch as their comrades were taken away by the 5-star Army's cavalry. Their eyes were filled with an inexplicable fear and uncertainty about the future. At this moment, the morale of the Baiming army began to drop rapidly. After all, they were injured by the enemy and had to be sent to the enemy for treatment. No matter how one looked at it, there was nothing to be proud of. How could they win against such an enemy? The morale of the Baiming army continued to decline, especially during the process of handing over the wounded soldiers. Many Baiming army soldiers had worried looks on their faces. When the last wounded soldier was handed over, the Baiming army was so silent that one could hear a pin drop. If there was any sound, it would be the sound of sobbing. Everyone was worried about whether they would live or die the next day. It was basically impossible to rely on such an army to win a battle. But knowing this, Gao Yu was helpless. The food in the army was getting less and less, and it was a great waste to give it to the wounded. Although they had lost face and lost morale, at least they still had enough food to eat and wouldn't cause a mutiny in the army. This way they could still live. This was undoubtedly the best news. In the 5-star army, Commander Qin Feng was responsible for receiving the wounded. 5 miles behind them, temporary military tents had been set up. From afar, the Red Cross symbols were very obvious. The logistics department had already received orders from the commander, Yang Si, to arrange for the hospital to be located here. Just treating the wounded was not enough. Yang Qindong had sent a telegram that he wanted to take down the Baiming army without shedding any blood. Receiving the wounded was just the first step, which was also the most likely thing to be done without causing a stir in the Baiming army. When the wounded were sent to the logistics hospital 5 miles behind them, the doctors and nurses who had been on standby for a long time all went out. Even the medical staff in the army almost all rushed here. There were more than 10,000 wounded soldiers. If there were not enough people, how could they treat them? How could they make an effect in a short time? Commander Qin Feng rode on a tall horse and was shouting, "Hurry up, immediately classify the wounded. Those with minor injuries, quickly treat them. Whoever treats them first will get a military merit." Stimulated by the military merit, all the medical staff became excited. Some of the Baiming army soldiers with minor injuries even became the target of the crowd. Qin Feng did not stop all this. He just needed to maintain order and make sure that there were no problems. At the same time, he admired Yang Qindong even more in his heart. As the person in charge of the specific work, Qin Feng naturally knew Yang Qindong's plan. It was precisely because he understood enough that he was more impressed by Yang Qindong's power. He firmly believed that doing so would definitely have an effect. He was looking forward to what would happen the moment the effect appeared. In the Baiming army, the wounded soldiers were sent out, but Gao Yu was still sitting alone in the tent. At this moment, the army was surrounded and the reinforcements were captured. Gao Yu, who had become an isolated army, did not know what to do. He did not dare to go out of the tent because once he went out he would face the sorrowful eyes of thousands of soldiers. This made Gao Yu very scared because he did not know what these soldiers would do once they were angry. Would they come to make trouble for him? Or even kill him? He did not dare to go out of the tent, so he just hid in the main tent like a coward. He forced himself to think optimistically. Wu Qingho must have known what happened here and he must have found a way to save him. It was also at this time that Gao Yu remembered Shi Heng's good. He also regretted not listening to him. Otherwise he would have made mistakes. How could it be like now, where the 400,000 soldiers were destroyed and now they were in a situation where they could neither advance nor retreat? Time passed by slowly. In the 5-star Army battlefield hospital, the first lightly wounded soldier had been successfully treated and walked out of the camp when it was almost dark. Originally, this person's injury was not very serious. Speaking of which, this was related to Li Laoxi's good luck. The arrow shot by the 5-star Army cavalry hit his calf, making him a glorious wounded soldier, and also avoided the bad result of fighting with the 5-star Army. Li Laoxi was born in a poor family, which could be seen from his somewhat perfunctory name. Speaking of which, in the Great Ming Dynasty, not everyone had the opportunity to learn to read and write. Only those who had accumulated merit and family property could learn to read and write. For example, Zhu Yuanzhang used to be called Zhu Zhongba. Because Li Laoxi was the fourth son in the family, he had this seemingly old-fashioned name. Li Laoxi, who had never had enough to eat, warm clothes, or good luck since he was young, suddenly changed and became the first patient in the logistics hospital to be treated. He still remembered when he appeared in the field hospital with a sorrowful expression. He didn't know what the future would be like and whether he would die. At that time, a group of doctors and nurses in white coats rushed in front of him. Yes, they rushed in front of him. He did not know what a doctor was, but he knew that they should be a doctor. As for nurses, it was the first time he heard such a name. What was even worse was that he found that these nurses were all young women, and there was no lack of beautiful women among them. Since young Li Laoxi, who was poor, did not have many opportunities to talk about marriage, and usually he did not have many opportunities to see women. After all, before women were married, they were particular about not going out of the house, and not taking a step out was virtuous. But now there were so many beautiful female nurses in close contact with him, and they did not mind that he was dirty, nor did they care about how long he had not bathed, or whether there was a strange smell on his body. They rushed over and cared about him, and they even dared to touch and look around his body without any intention of disliking him. At this moment, even Li Laoxi's eyes and face turned red. For the first time he felt ashamed of having a strange smell on his body. Presumably, this was a manifestation of his self-esteem. The doctors and nurses were not only concerned on the surface, but they were really concerned about Li Laoxi's injury. They first used a high degree of alcohol unique to Xianxia to disinfect it. Then they tested the depth of the arrow's penetration into the skin. After confirming that it did not hurt the bones, they pulled it out with a swish. Then they stopped the bleeding, bandaged the wound, and gave it a nutrient solution. In fact, Li Laoxi's injury was not that serious, and the arrow did not penetrate his skin very deeply. However, because there were too many examples of people who were shot by arrows and died because they pulled out the arrow, it forced others to feel a sense of fear. After a round of emergency treatment, Li Laoxi finally stood up when it was dark and could walk on his own. For this, the doctors and nurses who had received military merits were naturally very happy. There was even a nurse who was so excited that she even walked forward and hugged Li Laoxi. Although this nurse was a little short and a little plump, Yang Qindong's aesthetic standards did not give her a high rating. However, in Li Laoxi's eyes, it was completely different. What was a short person? Without enough nutrition, they could not even eat their fill. Being short was just a common problem in the Great Ming Dynasty. As for being a little fat, that was a good thing. With thick fat, it would be very useful to warm the bed at night. More importantly, a fat person's buttocks would also be a little bigger. That was proof that they could give birth to babies. At this moment, Li Laoxi's heart was moved. At this time, when the doctor and nurse suggested that Li Laoxi should go and see the surrounded Baiming soldiers in a fully healed state, he agreed without any hesitation. Not only that, he also decided to follow the 5-star army in the future. If there was anything that motivated him, it would be that he wanted to marry this fat nurse. He had already heard that as long as he achieved military merits in the 5-star army and became an officer of a certain rank, he could apply for marriage. He also had the qualifications to find a female soldier as his wife if both parties were in love. Although Li Laoxi did not know what it meant to be in love, he did not understand. However, he knew that he liked this female nurse, and this female nurse was not betrothed yet. All of this was enough. Li Laoxi was the first to be treated. Before dawn the next day, there were more than 200 lightly injured people who walked out of their beds. They belonged to the group that did not have a lot of injuries, but they lacked sufficient medical help. When Commander Qin Feng arrived at the hospital early in the morning and saw the more than 300 Baiming soldiers who could already move freely, his eyes lit up. Good job. All the medical personnel have meritorious service. Later, report the specific name list. By the way, have they finished their ideological work? Chapter 1348. The doctors and nurses who had been waiting for the results all cheered happily when they heard that they could record the merit. When they were asked if they had done a good job, everyone answered excitedly, "Yes, they are grateful for our kindness and are willing to do things obediently." The ancients were mostly kind people. Naturally, they would repay the kindness of saving their lives. Furthermore, the request made by the doctors and nurses was not excessive. They only wanted them to walk around the encirclement of the northern Ming army. It was not dangerous or tiring, and they could even repay their benefactors for saving their lives. So why would they not do it? The answers of the medical staff made Commander Qin Feng very satisfied. He was in a good mood and immediately waved his arms and said, "Very good, let's go and prepare. Oh right, take out the pigs and beef and give them to the Han soldiers who have abandoned the dark side. The quantity must be sufficient." Pigs were also called porpoises in the Great Ming Dynasty. They did not have much value in the past. In the end, it was because the way they were raised was not profitable and they could not be fattened. The input and output were not proportional, so naturally they were not paid attention to. The appearance of Yang Chendong changed everything. Not long after the boars were born, he fanned them. The pigs, who had no desires, began to eat and sleep. They had no desire to pursue a life of eating and sleeping. Naturally, their bodies also began to grow. Now pork had become one of the indispensable meat in the entire Xianxia army. Even in the first city there were a lot of pigs. This time a lot of them were transported to the front line. Now it was not difficult to take out a small portion to provide for more than 300 wounded people. The more than 300 wounded people who had basically recovered had something in their hands. Some were holding a pig's trotter, some were fat pig's knuckle, and some were holding delicious beef. Under the protection of the cavalry of the 5-star army, they walked towards the encampment of the Baiming army. The originally listless and unmotivated Baiming army camp suddenly had a lot of cavalry of the 5-star army outside, which immediately attracted everyone's attention. Under the heavy encirclement, the Baiming army did not need to train anymore. This way they could save some food. They who had nothing to do suddenly found something interesting to watch. They quickly gathered together and stared at the slowly approaching 5-star army cavalry. The 5-star army's cavalry approached as if there was no one around. When the two sides were only 150 paces apart, and were about to reach the range of the arrows, the cavalry stopped advancing and began to line up on both sides. In this way, the 300 or so Baiming army soldiers who had recovered from their wounds appeared in front of everyone. They were all tearing up the meat in their hands, and their faces were filled with satisfaction. This sudden scene naturally aroused the curiosity of the Baiming soldiers. They didn't know what the 5-star army was up to, so they just watched with wide eyes. But as he watched, he suddenly heard a shout. "Hey, isn't that Zhang Qi? Wasn't his arm injured? That arrow was still stuck in his arm yesterday. Why does it look like nothing happened now?" "That's Li Laosi. We're from the same hometown. He was shot in the calf, but why is he moving freely now?" "That's Xiaoshi too. He was also shot in the calf, but..." Shouts sounded one after another. Only then did everyone realize that the people who appeared here were the wounded soldiers who were sent out yesterday. They were also their comrades. They were still wounded yesterday, but now not only had their bodies recovered, they were even eating and drinking. This scene stimulated many people. Some of the soldiers who were useless or who had not eaten their fill couldn't help but swallow. It was obvious that they were hungry. Li Laosi and the others were like giant pandas being watched by people. They stood there and walked back and forth, trying their best to show off their abilities. Of course, their mouths weren't idle either. They kept eating and looking very happy. The display didn't last very long. In less than an hour, the 5-star army cavalry retreated with the 300 or so Baiming prisoners. They didn't speak on the way here, but when they left, they shouted, "If there are any more wounded soldiers, our 5-star army will continue to receive them." The 5-star army finally left. The remaining Baiming army soldiers looked at each other. They didn't know what to do. If they didn't fight, where would the wounded soldiers come from? Were these words passed down wrongly? However, there were also some astute people. After their eyes kept rolling, a ruthless look flashed past as if they had made some kind of decision. Not long after, more than an hour, many wounded soldiers suddenly appeared in the barracks. They had some knife wounds on their arms or legs. In their own words, they accidentally injured themselves when they were training hard. In order to save food, Gao Yu had already ordered that there was no need to train. However, there were still people who took the initiative to train and got injured. Even the slowest person would know what had happened. How could it be an accident? It was clearly intentional. It was hard for these people. In order to pretend to be wounded soldiers, they were so ruthless that they used their own bodies to cut themselves. At the same time, some ruthless soldiers followed suit. The number of wounded soldiers in the Baiming army began to increase. Before noon, there were more than 10,000 wounded soldiers, and this number was still increasing. When the results were reported to Gao Yu in the main tent, he only blinked a few times and knew what had happened. Although he didn't step out of the tent as an embroidered uniform guard, he still placed a lot of spies outside to ensure that he would know immediately if something important happened. Of the wounded soldiers who were sent away yesterday, more than 300 of them were healed today. Of course he knew about this. He had also lamented the strength of the 5-star army's logistical support. At least in this aspect the Baiming army couldn't do it. However, it was just a sigh. In Gao Yu's eyes, the thing that the great Ming dynasty didn't lack the least was people. Especially after Ren Xuanji's rule, the great Ming dynasty's population had nearly doubled. In the eyes of the officials, people were the most worthless existence. The 5-star army expended a lot of effort to heal the wounded. This was a waste of resources and it must have cost a lot. With this money, wouldn't it be better to build a new army? With this mentality, Gao Yu didn't take this matter to heart. It wasn't until he heard the report that there were more than 10,000 wounded soldiers in the army, and the number was still increasing, that his face changed greatly. Gao Yu wasn't a brainless person. On the contrary, his thoughts were very active and he quickly figured out the truth of the matter. It was because of this that he was very angry. In order to openly surrender to the 5-star army, these soldiers actually had the courage to harm themselves. At this time, Gao Yu wanted to give the order to not send the wounded soldiers to the 5-star army's barracks. He wanted to see these soldiers fall into a trap of their own making. However, he quickly shook his head. At this time it was easy to neglect but not easy to stop. Otherwise, a mutiny in the army would be unavoidable. Thinking that there wasn't much food left in the army, it would be better to send these soldiers who didn't have any integrity out. They could save a lot of food. Thus, he simply waved his pen and agreed to send these wounded soldiers to the 5-star army's barracks. At night, more than 18,000 Baiming soldiers with all kinds of minor injuries were sent back to the barracks by the 5-star army's cavalry. When the other Baiming army soldiers saw the scene, they fell into deep thought. As a result, on that night, more than 70,000 wounded soldiers were sent back to the barracks. This was a serious injury to his muscles and bones. Currently, Gao Yu only had 130,000 soldiers. If these 70,000 soldiers were sent away, he would only have less than 50,000 soldiers left. How could he contend against the 5-star army with such a small amount of soldiers? He was afraid that once the enemy charged over, he would be finished. However, if he agreed, wouldn't he be digging his own grave? If he didn't agree, he was afraid of a mutiny in the army. At this moment, Gao Yu realized that he had overestimated the loyalty of these soldiers to Baiming. Did he think that only a few soldiers with no moral integrity would surrender? Gao Yu didn't know what integrity was. When a person didn't even have enough to eat, what integrity was there to talk about? If you tried to talk to him, it would be a light punishment if he didn't beat you until you couldn't take care of yourself. Gao Yu was having a headache. Li Keguang and Zhou Xian were also having a headache in a general's tent not far from the main tent. They had previously thought of surrendering to the 5-star army in order to survive. In fact, they had even made up their minds to tie up Gao Yu and surrender to the 5-star army. But now the situation had suddenly changed. Countless wounded soldiers had appeared. It seemed that they didn't need to tie people up to achieve their goal. The 5-star army treated the wounded extremely well. They didn't even kill normal soldiers. As generals, they shouldn't be killed so easily. Why don't we stab ourselves too? Xianxia thought about it and discussed with Li Keguang. How can we do that? Our bodies, hair and skin were all given to us by our parents. How can we do something like self-harm? How can we face our parents who raised us? Li Keguang said righteously. However, only he knew that he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Xianxia was reprimanded and his face was a little red. How could he bring himself to do it? He just couldn't think of a way, so he gave it a try. Then what should we do? There are more than 70,000 wounded soldiers. Once we surrender, we'll be done for. Without an army, even if we're captured by the 5-star army in the end, we won't have any merits. No merits? This answer made Li Keguang very unhappy. He shook his head. No, we're generals. How can we be the same as other people? Even if we surrender, the 5-star army still has to earn merits. Are we really going to go against our superiors? Zhou Xian said with a bitter face. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.